if the front benches are ready. We now come to the motions relating to local government finance, which will be debated together. I call the Secretary of State to move the motion on the local government finance report. Secretary of State, Steve, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper be approved. Before I begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to notify the House that the local government finance report has been updated with small corrections on pages 7 and 13. These corrections have been passed on to the House in the proper way ahead of today's debate. Like you, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am grateful to the Select Committee on Statutory Instruments for its careful consideration of these reports. I believe in local government because I've lived it. As a councillor and as a council leader, I saw the difference that councils make to people's lives. Local government is the part of our democracy that is closest to people and the things that they care about the most: their family, their community and their hometown. Labour took office after 14 years of ideological cuts imposed on local government. The Tories devolved the blame for their failure in national government by imposing £16 billion of cuts on councils and local communities. Even worse, they targeted the worst of those cuts deliberately on our poorest communities. The former Prime Minister was filmed standing in a leafy garden in Tunbridge Wells, boasting about how the Conservatives have stripped away funding from struggling towns so they could play politics with public money.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way on that point. Has he done the analysis on how the division of the Pride in Place funding has gone between Labour and Reform seats versus Liberal Democrat and Conservative seats?
Well, I actually thought he was going to stand up and apologise for the House for what his government did in diverting money away from the poorest communities. I'm very disappointed, and I suspect I'm not the only one, that he didn't take that opportunity. Perhaps he'll take the opportunity later on. But I would remind him and his colleagues that under the Tories, only 3 in 10 councils received funding that aligned with deprivation. With this government, it's over 9 in every 10. And local people were forced to pay a staggeringly high price for Tory venality. High streets were hollowed out and boarded up. The number of people sleeping rough on our streets doubled. The number of families stuck in temporary accommodation doubled. More potholes on our roads than craters on the moon. I give way so he can apologise for that.
Well, I was going to say thank you, actually, for the Pride in Place money, and I'm very grateful to the government for giving £20 million for my constituency. But on the subject of funding for councils, the government is now requiring district councils to pay for food recycling, which is not an unreasonable proposition. But there was a principle under the previous government of new burdens funding, where when a new burden would be presented to a council, the government would sort it out. Why has your government, Madam Deputy Speaker, why has the Minister's government decided not to support councils with new burdens funding?
Secretary of State.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for his words about Pride in Place, and I'm glad he's answered his colleague's question, because, of course, it is being distributed to constituencies represented by members from right across the House. The point that he makes about food waste recycling, funding for that has been built into the settlement. So it is present, and the new burden is indeed being funded in that way.
So the Minister's being incredibly kind on that. But he talks about the settlement. The settlement doesn't work. In War Forest District Council, we've had a 0% increase in the core funding, and indeed across the whole of Worcestershire, dare I say it, Madam Deputy Speaker, where there has been a district council with a Conservative Member of Parliament, there has been a 0 increase. Where there have been a district council with a Labour Member of Parliament, there has been up to a 5% increase. Can the Labour Minister perhaps explain why this has happened?
Secretary of State.
The settlement follows a funding formula, and it takes account of the costs of delivering food waste recycling in the way that he described earlier on. But if I might just return to my theme for a moment, Madam Deputy Speaker, before I take any more interventions, he will remember, as colleagues across the House will, that the Tories used to belittle local councillors as part-time volunteers. and they took away their pension rights to deter people from risking a career on the front line of local government. So today it falls to this government to fix the foundations that the Tories smashed apart. We are rebuilding local government so councils can rebuild their communities. We are making good our promise to introduce multi-year funding settlements so councils can plan for the future with certainty. We are reconnecting funding with need so we can take off the Tory shackles that have held back so many of our towns and our communities for so long. And we are ending wasteful bidding wars for funding, freeing councils to focus on filling in potholes, not filling in forms. We are putting fairness back into a system the Tories bragged about breaking. We reject the decline that ripped the hearts out of towns and communities up and down this country. We choose change. Have to give way.
For giving way, Shropshire Council is about to see a 10% cut in its core funding from central government, having been terribly badly run by the Conservatives for the previous 16 years before the Lib Dem administration took over in May. The government has given it permission to put up its council tax by 9% without a referendum. That doesn't even touch the side of the cut in funding from central government. How is Shropshire, that needs to receive exceptional financial support in this year, ever going to fill that ever-growing black hole unless the funding from government reflects the cost of delivering services in rural areas?
Yeah. I believe she's had several meetings with my colleague, the Minister for Local Government, but I think it is right that we should align funding with need. It's very important that that is done. It's the only way to ensure that funding is fair across the whole country. That is what we promised to do in our manifesto. That is what we are doing with this settlement. Now, I've taken an awful lot of intervention so far. I don't want to leave no time for one last one, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Secretary of State? He's been very generous with his time, and may I just say that, like him, I also, as a councillor, saw appalling pressures put on our local council in Reading, whilst funding actually went up in neighbouring Wokingham, which is a much better off area and was then controlled by the Conservatives. And I do appreciate his work on readjusting the settlement to reflect need. That should be a fundamental point of any allocation of resources to local government. Would he like to say a little bit more about his work on this and how it's going to benefit residents on the smallest incomes in the most disadvantaged communities?
Secretary of State.
Well, I mean, at core, what we're hearing from all sides of the House at the moment is people's views on the fact that under the previous government, the alignment between funding and deprivation was broken, and this government is bringing it back. Because they did nothing about it for 14 years, it became extremely detached from deprivation. So putting it back in and making sure that funding goes where the need is greatest, not, as the former Prime Minister bragged, stealing money from the poorest communities to pork barrel Tory areas, can no longer go on. Now, I will...
That might ripen for him for giving way. But I say, I think it's been a little unfair to the Tories opposite, a little unfair. If you look at the cuts under austerity from 2010 to 2024, the biggest cuts actually came from 2010 to 2015, when the Lib Dems were in coalition. Perhaps they should share some of the blame as well.
Well, I certainly agree that the Lib Dems should share the blame for austerity. I was, in fact, a council leader myself while the Lib Dems and Tories were in coalition together. I think they cut our council by a third just over the first 1 or 2 years that they were in power. And now they have the chutzpah to stand up and complain that this government is putting some of it back. So I really think they should reflect. Now, I've taken an awful lot of interventions, more from this side of the House than from my own side of the House. So with your kindness, I will make a little progress. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I would like to thank all of those who contributed to the provisional settlement consultation. We listened carefully to views expressed by councils and MPs, and today I am pleased to announce an additional £740 million in new grant funding over and above the provisional settlement. This means that by the end of the multi-year settlement, councils will benefit from a 15.5% increase in core spending power worth over £11.4 billion compared to 2025-26. When this government took office, we introduced the recovery grant, targeted on those areas held back the most by Tory and Lib Dem austerity. This year, we have maintained that grant, so every upper-tier council that received it will see a real terms boost. If I can make just a little more progress, then I will certainly come to him. I can announce a £440 million uplift to the recovery grant over the multi-year settlement, targeted at councils the Tories hit with below-average funding increases. By the end of this Parliament, we will have invested a total of £2.6 billion in the most deprived councils through the recovery grant, over and above what they receive through the settlement. I've also listened carefully to feedback from the sector about business rates pooling, and as a result, I'm compensating any authorities that would have lost funding this year so they have time to adapt to the new arrangements.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. I was council leader at St Helens for 5 years before coming here in July 2024. I just want to say thank you to the Minister for Local Government as well, and ministers who were there before them in the department for the engagement, because I can tell you the relationship now is different to what it was before. The conversation we've had since the provisional settlement has been constructive. It's been good. It's been done in good spirit, and I'm very grateful for the result that we've got for St Helens because, sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2010 St Helens got £127 million a year from the last Labour government. But party opposite left opposite was £13 million a year. Does the Secretary of State share my absolute shock at the brass neck of members opposite?
Interventions can be just as short and productive.
I thank him very much for his intervention, and what he's seeing is the realignment of funding with deprivation, and that is as it should be. Because above all, I will take one more, then I'm going to continue.
He has been tremendously generous, and he's been doing his normal barnstorming political knockabout speech. Perhaps he may start to act more like a Secretary of State, because the low-income residents of the East Riding, of whom there are many, and in Beverley and Holderness, are going to have a £200 council tax bombshell. The smallest house is going to be paying £200 more in 3 years' time, and will have reduced overall funding to support public services after the increase in costs imposed by the government. That is the reality. And why? So my question to the Secretary of State is, he said he wants to focus on need. Why has rurality been removed from need when it's such a real issue?
Well, the easy answer to that one is it hasn't been. It's still there. Right. Above all else, Madam Deputy Speaker, this settlement is about fairness, because we on this side of the House reject the Tory belief that our poorest communities should be left to sink with less funding and worse public services than other parts of the country. That approach pulled our country apart, and in doing that, it was profoundly unpatriotic. Our settlement reflects a council's ability to raise income locally, and it reflects the fact that it costs more to deliver services in different parts of the country, retaining rurality funding for social care, because we recognise workers in those areas have to travel longer distances. We have used the most up-to-date data on deprivation to make sure funding accurately follows need. I'm going to make progress, I'm afraid. We are introducing changes gradually over the period of the settlement, so councils have time to adapt, and we are protecting councils' income, including from business rates growth. Today's settlement is a milestone in returning councils to a sustainable financial footing, and a milestone in restoring fairness to local government funding. One last time.
I'm incredibly grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. He calls it a milestone. I call it a millstone. He talks about fairness. In my Spelthorne constituency, we have Stanwell. That hits the markers for the double deprivation criteria, which would have got the Pride in Place funding. But it gets diluted by the fact that we have more affluent areas in my constituency. How is that fair to the people of Stanwell, that they don't qualify for Pride in Place funding just because they're surrounded by more affluent areas? Isn't the Secretary of State just going to engineer pockets of deprivation continuing rather than helping?
Secretary of State.
I'm afraid he's misunderstood how it works because it doesn't get diluted. The way that it operates is by looking at super output areas on a very small level, so we can ensure that the funding goes to those areas that have the highest levels of deprivation, and I would be happy to write to him about that if it would help him to understand how it works better. Now, for the vast majority of councils, Madam Deputy Speaker, incomes in council tax will be restricted to 3%, and 2%, I'm going to make some progress, I'm afraid, and 2% for the adult social care precept. There are a few councils facing extremely challenging financial pressures that the previous government turned into a crisis by ignoring their problems for over a decade. In response to requests from those councils, I am giving them flexibility to increase their council tax above referendum principles next year. Unlike the previous government, we will not agree any increases which could lead to households in these areas paying above national average council tax. But we will not let councils go to the wall and see their residents punished with failing services. These flexibilities will apply to Warrington, Trafford, Worcestershire, Shropshire, North Somerset, Windsor and Maidenhead, and Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. One fire authority will also be granted additional flexibility. These are caps, not targets, and no area with additional flexibility will see bills rise above the national average.
Will the Secretary of State get on that point? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for making that point around council tax and having that flexibility for local councils. But will he agree with the Local Government Association, who are worried, and they state that council tax is not the solution to financial challenges facing local government, and it places an existing burden on some of the most poorest households? Does he agree that we should now be looking at council tax reform?
Secretary of State.
Well, I agree with the chair of the Select Committee insofar as council tax cannot be the only means to fix these problems. That's why we've increased the level of funding overall and reconnected it with the deprivation indices that tell us which areas have the greatest need and therefore should get a fair share of the funding that's available. Now, the Home Secretary and I have also agreed an additional £3.50 council tax flexibility for 6 police and crime commissioners in 2026-27, where this was critical to financial sustainability in maintaining law and order. It is for councillors, mayors and police and crime commissioners to set their own council tax and take into account the impact on households when taking those decisions. Nationally, council tax will not increase by more than it did last year. 6 local authorities set council tax bills between £450 and £1,000 lower than the national average because of the high value of homes in their areas. The previous government made no adjustment in the formula for this, creating unfairness in the funding formula. It is not fair that people living in our poorest communities should subsidise rock-bottom bills in some of our wealthiest areas. So I am giving these councils additional flexibility to manage their budgets as we align funding with need, as we should. For councils that need some support to balance their budgets this year, we will no longer just sign off borrowing or the sale of assets without a credible approach to reforming services to get back to financial stability. Later this month, I will be confirming arrangements for supporting councils in the most difficult positions, but they will be expected to bring forward plans for more effective and sustainable services built on sustainable budgeting into the future. I just want to make some progress because I've taken quite a lot of interventions, but I will bring them in before the end. Look, I know that local government is still under pressure, and we won't bury our heads in the sand or dodge the difficult decisions. The adult social care system is in crisis, and we're facing up to that by transforming it. This settlement makes available around £4.6 billion of additional funding for adult social care in 2028-29 compared to 2025-26, including £500 million for the sector's first ever fair pay agreement. That means more carers getting better pay with the time to provide the high-quality, compassionate care they want to give, and it will get us moving towards a national care service that gives better quality care, joined-up services, and more choice and independence for people.
Thank
the Secretary of State for giving way, and we're very grateful for the settlement and the announcements that he's making today. But both Redbridge in my constituency, both Redbridge and Waltham Forest are receiving significant uplifts from this Parliament, and ministers have been excellent in listening to those arguments for both of our London boroughs. But whilst this won't be enough to fill the immediate financial gaps left by the Tories, it is a step forward. However, given that temporary accommodation costs have risen so much in London by about 75% over the last 5 years, will the Minister help to set out how the Government is acting to expand the supply of socially rented homes?
I thank him for his comments and his recognition that funding is indeed now following deprivation. He'll find the answer to that in the homelessness strategy, and I'm going to come on to comments on that. And I will speed up because Madam Deputy Speaker is indicating at her wrist, so I need to make some progress. Now, on children's social care again, the system was left on its knees. That is why this government is driving forward the biggest transformation of children's social care in a generation, by rolling out the Families First Partnership Programme. This government has backed the programme with nearly £3 billion over 4 years, including over £2.4 billion investment in this multi-year settlement. It gives local authorities, police and health partners the tools to provide families with the right support at the right time, shifting the system from expensive statutory provision towards early intervention and preventative support. It will help families stay together, divert thousands of children from care and transform the outcomes and well-being of children across the country. This investment in the Families First Partnership Programme marks a milestone in transforming the children's social care system, but we recognise the children's social care residential market is fundamentally broken. Local authorities are being pushed to the brink, while some private providers are making excessive profits. This cannot and it will not continue. Instead, we're working to reduce reliance on residential care and move towards a system rooted in family environments through fostering. Last week, the government set out a plan to expand fostering for 10,000 more children by the end of this Parliament. The evidence is clear that taking this approach will be better for children and better for the local authorities who provide the services. Using the new powers in the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, we will explore implementing a profit cap in the children's social care placement market to ensure public money delivers value and care, not profiteering. It's obvious that the current SEND system is not working for children and families, and we know that it's not working for councils either, which are seeing funding for neighbourhood services diverted into a broken system. The government is bringing forward ambitious reforms that will create a better and financially sustainable SEND system, built on early, high-quality support for kids with SEND to improve their time at schools and maximise their potential throughout life. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education, will set out the details of these reforms in the upcoming Schools White Paper. But crucially, we are taking action now to support local authorities as we move towards that reformed system. We will deliver this in phases. The first phase will address historic deficits accrued up to the end of 25-26. All local authorities with SEND deficits will receive a grant covering 90% of their high-need deficit up to the end of 2025-26. This is subject to local authorities securing Department for Education's approval of a local SEND reform plan. And on homelessness too, we know that temporary accommodation, as my colleague has said, is a growing financial pressure on councils, with near record levels of rough sleeping and declining social housing stock. So the final settlement also provides a £272 million uplift to the homelessness, rough sleeping and domestic abuse grant, taking total investment delivered through the settlement to £2.7 billion. On the ground, that will mean families off the streets, kids out of temporary accommodation, instead living in safe, secure homes, people's lives put back on course. And we're matching that landmark investment with our national plan to end homelessness, led by my honourable friend, to put the full might of the state behind preventing homelessness before it happens. Madam Deputy Speaker, just to bring it to an end, today's settlement is about keeping a promise to repair the broken foundations of local government, a promise to put the heart back into our communities. When the last government slashed councils to the bone, the consequences were severe. The services people use every day were undermined. Streets became filthy and people's lives got tougher. The hard work of councillors, mayors and frontline staff kept vital services running during those hard Tory years, and we thank them for the work they did in those circumstances. Our aim is a future where councillors working with their communities have the freedom to innovate, rebuilding public services and investing in high streets, youth clubs and libraries. We are fixing the foundations so councils and their communities can build the public services, renew the high streets and shape the future they want to see.
Is the motion on the local government finance report as on the order paper. And before I call the Shadow Minister, I have a deferred division result. Order, order. I will now announce the result of today's deferred division. Draft Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment, Extension to Maritime Activities, Order 2026. The ayes were 362, the noes were 107, so the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And I call the Shadow Minister, David Simmonds.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know the Secretary of State and I will have had long experience of working with Morgan McSweeney in his many days as head of the Labour group at the Local Government Association. And I think that influence is reflected in the very political speech which we've just heard from the Secretary of State, which I have to say, despite its political excellence, I am struggling to reconcile with what is actually in the finance statement, which he has laid before the House to agree this afternoon. Now, we do have a high level of agreement that local government touches all of our lives and our communities. We recognise its huge potential to develop our economy, to improve public health, to give children a great start in life. And we know that there are over 800 different services delivered by the average local authority in this country. They are there for us literally from cradle to grave. And they are led by those democratically elected councillors who run budgets that are bigger than many government departments and in organisations that are more complex than many a FTSE 100 business. But having served like the Secretary of State as a councillor under the last Labour government, we see a swift reversion to type. Announcements of funding for social housing arriving maybe towards the end of the decade. Funding for schools from VAT on fees on private education amounting to a real terms cut in state school funding. And a massive diversion at the heart of what the Secretary of State has set out of funding away from the legally enforceable statutory duties placed on councils by this Parliament towards generalised poverty as a driver of those allocations, which are leaving councils, of course.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Does he acknowledge that the Labour government has abolished the Rural Services Delivery Grant? This has cost Somerset Council £4.1 million. It's cost other rural counties many millions of pounds in rural counties where it's more expensive to provide services. And does he agree with me that this is Labour diverting money from rural areas that are desperately in need to Labour strongholds in the north?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the member for Bridgwater is absolutely spot on. And when we look at the analysis that's been produced by the County Council's network, they made a comparison. What is the funding pressure on those statutory services facing the urban councils that are the beneficiaries of the government's largesse? It totals £180 million a year. What is the budget gap facing rural areas as a result of this government's decision? They face a £2.7 billion black hole.
Will you allow me?
Of course.
That is nothing new. In every one of the last 29 years, people in the New Forest who are lucky enough to have a modest property in the forest and a mansion in the city have come to me to complain about how much more it costs them for their modest property in council tax in the forest. And I've told them that the one is subsidising the other. But the reality is, for those people who are not in that fortunate position, young families with only one property in my parliamentary constituency, they are subsidising the north and the cities, and they can't afford it.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I hesitate to disagree with the honourable member for New Forest West. It wasn't ever thus. The Rural Services Grant referred to by the member for Bridgewater was a measure to address those additional cost burdens, direct costs arising from statutory duties, and a funding stream which is being removed by this Labour government. Of course, I'll give way to them, my constituency neighbour.
Grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. He will remember that when the Conservative Party took control of Harrow Council 4 years ago, they did so, and presumably he campaigned on this promise, of freezing council tax. Instead, council tax has risen by 20% over the last 4 years. So will he take the opportunity now to apologise to the people of Pinner, and indeed Harrow more generally, for his party saying one thing when they were campaigning and doing exactly the reverse and increasing the cost of living for his constituents and my constituents?
Madam Deputy Speaker, not wishing to be parochial, I'm sure he would also like to join in the apologies for the appalling level of corruption that had taken place under Labour in the London Borough of Harrow, who left an astonishing legacy of cost overruns in the local authority's highways department, something which I know has been very much covered in the local and the national media, which I know has taken a good deal to recover from. I'm sure we wouldn't want the House to be inadvertently misled about the impact of that. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the warning lights, of course.
Grateful to my honourable friend, and far from my typical habit to get involved in political knockabout, but following that astonishing intervention of showing such a total lack of self-awareness, does he remember that the now Prime Minister saying that not a penny would go up in council tax? And yet this settlement assumes 5% a year on low-income people in rural East Yorkshire at the same time that core funding is cut. £200 hit for the smallest house in our area, while, as my right honourable friend commented on earlier, very valuable homes in central London seem to pay a fraction of the amount.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I apologise, right honourable member for New Forest West. But the member we've just heard from is absolutely correct. We need to reflect on the fact that when ministers talk about additional resources provided to local government, that 2/3 of the funding in this settlement, 2/3 alone, comes from the maximum possible council tax rise across the country. And a large chunk of the rest is coming from a huge rise in business rates. Of course, I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. It's interesting to hear him completely remove from his memory what happened in the 14 years of his government. You have to remember back to when this began in 2010, when council tax generated about 20% of council funding, and how it's grown over the years under the Conservative and coalition governments to actually deliver now more than half of local government funding. How can he say this is a problem when his government originated that process?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that that prompts me to move on to the next part of what I think we need to say, because let's recall, for those who cry austerity at these benches, that the last Labour government spent, on average, 10% more every year of its final decade in office than it raised in taxes, which left a colossal legacy of debt that we've scarcely yet begun to repay. Millions were squandered on projects like building schools for the future that were cancelled at the tail end of the last Labour government by Alistair Darling as they ran out of money. So when we see those authorities, I'm just going to move on a little bit, but I'll bring you in a moment. But when we look at the reports of what this means at constituency level, councils like Surrey that have embraced this Labour government's devolution agenda, that have now lost the opportunity for the mayor that they were promised, they report that this leaves them £60 million a year short. honourable members will be ill-served by the consequences of this budget. I give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to him giving way. I'm sure he didn't mean to inadvertently mislead the House, but as I was a councillor in Hartlepool in 2010, I can tell them with absolute assurity it was the Conservatives who cancelled the Building Schools for the Future programme, and I think you take the opportunity to correct the record. You cancelled it, we initiated it. They cancelled it, we initiated it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity. Now, one of my tasks in the world of local government was to engage with that last Labour government, and as we saw, the disastrous consequences of its overspending, they were completely clear with authorities like mine that stopped work on BSF because we were told by the Department for Education that they did not have the money to see through the promises that they were making to the public. I am very confident that my constituents understand the consequences that a Labour government has on their politics. I'll give way to my constituency neighbour.
I'd like to thank. He's very generous with his time and always have a lot of time for the right honourable member. He's talking about our constituents in Hillingdon. Is it not the case that the last Tory government's financial settlement, which also included council tax, had a 7% cut to core spending power for our constituents in Hillingdon, and this spending settlement has almost a 40% increase in core spending power for our constituents? He seems rather depressed about this announcement. Surely that is fantastic news for our constituents. And wouldn't he agree with me that, thank God, we've got a Labour government for Hillingdon?
Madam Deputy, I appreciate he knows rather more about Camden Council than he does about Hillingdon Council. But let us reflect if we want to think about history. Our constituents last had a Labour council. Our constituents last had a Labour council in 1998. I went to that budget meeting, at which our constituents were faced with an 18.7% council tax rise, £60 million of unfunded efficiency savings by a Labour council. I think they understand where their political priorities lie and who has their interests at heart. So I'm just going to make a little bit of progress. I know Madam Deputy Speaker will want others to have time. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, history is repeating itself. And let's not forget, this is a statement that leaves 2/3 of councils in England worse off, from the analysis that's been done by the Local Government Association. And that piles additional costs on top of things like last year's national insurance contributions rise, which left councils £1.5 billion net worse off. This is a statement which tightens ring-fencing, so it removes the ability of local leaders to deploy, for example, homelessness funding flexibly to meet local needs. And it comes at a time when this botched reorganisation of local government has created chaos across the sector, a hokey-cokey of elections promised, then cancelled, sometimes within 24 hours from that dispatch box. And above all, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. On local government reorganisation, does my honourable friend agree with me that one of the problems of the current process that is going forward with this statement in mind is that there's been no direction on how the funding is going to work out? So actually you've got some proposals on the table that would leave enormously vast rural communities in constituencies like mine, neighbouring town and urban centres that see it as an opportunity to get what they want. And that actually, given this statement, it doesn't give those rural councils any confidence that they would get the money that they need once LGR has taken place.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. My honourable friend draws attention to another significant issue facing local authorities, which is the level of uncertainty, that money has been promised, then withdrawn, budgets have been allocated and then reduced. And in that context, I'm sure her constituents will be as concerned as I am that so much of this money is simply built into massive tax rises across the country. And just turning briefly to business rates, we know, including from the question from the member from Stourbridge at PMQs, that the pressure is being acutely felt on our high streets, especially in hospitality and retail. A business owner in my constituency yesterday told me that across his food franchise, the business rates rise alone is an additional £100,000 a year. That's a lot of entry-level jobs at risk. It's price rises for consumers fuelling inflation. It's a barrier to investments in our high street. and it is replicated across the country. So let's not forget that under the previous government, one of the things we are most proud of is the 800 new jobs on average created every single day that we were in office. And let us never cease to remind the benches opposite that every single month under this Labour government, unemployment has risen. This is a government, Madam Deputy Speaker, that clearly does not respect our local colleagues. It refers to leaders as mere community conveners. It seeks to reduce the level of discretion that our councillors have. It creates uncertainty through a lack of clarity on reorganisation, on SEND deficits, on whether mayoral elections are going ahead. And at a time when thousands of voters are being denied a say by this government through cancelling elections, a situation caused solely by the Secretary of State's abject failure to deliver the government's devolution plans to the proposed timetable. It is one thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, to cancel elections in a council that is about to be abolished so voters can instead choose its replacement. Very much another one to defer them indefinitely whilst we wait for him to get his act together. Madam Deputy Speaker, our councils and our communities deserve a better statement than this. And let me conclude with some points which I hope the Secretary of State or others will address in the summing up. Because one of the things that is most striking about this statement is that the Secretary of State has come to the Chamber and said the key priority for this government is addressing poverty and deprivation. Poverty and deprivation do not feature in this local government funding settlement. They are not part of this formula that the Secretary of State is asking us to agree at all. But what is very striking is the things he says are important. Vulnerable children in education, cash flat, same as last year. Virtual schools, cash flat. The revenue support grant for our local authorities is cash flat. Personal advisors to care leavers, cash flat. Money for supporting local authorities with social care, which was specifically described as a priority, cash flat. Bog-off campaigns intended to reduce obesity in the public health environment, 50% reduction. And even Awab's law, which was championed at that dispatch box just a short time ago by the Minister for Planning, sees a cut of £26,000 from its paltry beginnings. So perhaps the Minister will reflect that what he's announcing essentially is a massive shift of funding away from the statutory duties of obligations that this Parliament has placed on our local authorities, and instead shifts it to those favoured political areas that it sees as its priority for the future.
Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Harrow Council was on the verge of bankruptcy until the substantial extra funding that ministers announced in the local government settlement. They were facing a budget deficit, council officers told the councillors, of over £32 million and were planning to use virtually the whole of the council's reserves to fill that gap if the settlement for Harrow had not been as generous as it was. They were even contemplating having to ask for exceptional financial support status. So I, in particular, welcome the 31% increase in funding over this Parliament following the government's announcement in December for Harrow Council. And for comparison, the last multi-year funding settlement under Theresa May and Boris Johnson for Harrow Council delivered just a 5% increase. So a 31% uplift over this Parliament is a significant step forward. And Harrow certainly needs it, because over the last 4 years, residents have become increasingly concerned about how the council has been managed. Council tax has increased by more than inflation every year. Rents and service charges imposed by the council have rocketed. Crucial parts of the council's responsibilities have been rated as inadequate and needing improvement. Basic critical services such as street cleaning have been cut to the bone. And new housing to ease the housing and homelessness crisis has been stalled, delayed or just axed. So without that increase in funding, council officers have told senior councillors that Harrow would have been facing the need to approach the Secretary of State at risk of bankruptcy and needing exceptional financial support. A combination of recent mismanagement of council finances and a decade of austerity has done considerable damage to our local public services in Harrow. Harrow remains, though, one of the lowest funded councils, both within London and nationally. And so I say gently to the Secretary of State, I hope he will understand when I say that I will continue to press for further funding to improve local services. It's worth underlining that between 2013 and 14 and 22-23, the council saw cuts in its funding from the Tory and Lib Dem governments of the time of more than £50 million, a reduction of a shocking 97% in the revenue support grants. One of the consequences of that level of austerity was vastly weakened public services locally.
Can I tell him about austerity?
I'm happy to give the honourable gentleman a way into the debate if he would like so, but perhaps he'd like to sit down and make a longer contribution later. No, okay, very much.
No, the one thing the Secretary of State got right when he was wagging his finger to my left was the implication on the Liberal Democrats. Danny Alexander was the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I was at the heart of that administration. He had to be restrained by George Osborne. So gung-ho was he to make greater cuts. Personally, I'd have given him his head, but don't let them escape.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to join him in condemning, again, the role the Liberal Democrats played. But if he was the sane voice in the government at the time, I hope he'll forgive me for being slightly even more concerned about what actually was going on at the time. One of the understated problems of the austerity that Harrow has suffered has been the decline in the quality of vital local services. Children's services were rated inadequate by Ofsted just last year, with 8 areas identified for immediate improvement. Leadership stability, including management oversight of staff and social workers in particular, the quality of support, advice and guidance for care leavers, the quality of help for children who are homeless, the consistency and quality of response when care leavers go missing, the consistency of staffing to support children who were rated as needing to support children. All of those areas were rated as needing immediate improvement. We're talking about some of the most vulnerable children in my community and across Harrow more generally, being let down by Harrow Council. 2 years beforehand, the Conservative councillors who lead Harrow Council had driven through major cuts in children's services at the time, over £2.5 million. Astonishingly, the current Conservative leadership locally are proposing another round of major cuts to children's services. One particular case stands out from my constituency. Parents reported what looked like significant bruising of a child's footprint on their child at their nursery. The matter was referred to social services. The parents were arrested and went to court, and the child taken into emergency foster care. The case against the parents was rightly eventually dropped when the court accepted that the original bruising was caused by a child's foot. But in the meantime, during supervised contact arranged by Harrow Social Services, the parents found extensive injuries on the child, reported those to the social worker. There should have been a serious investigation at the time, given the scale of the injuries. There wasn't. And in the nearly 3 years since, the council have struggled to get answers to their questions, and the parents inevitably remain profoundly affected by what has happened to their child and what as a family they have been put through. I wish I could say that was an isolated case. It isn't. And so whilst I welcome the additional funding that the council will get, and as a result will be able to put into social care for young people, I do think there are other measures that I hope the Secretary of State will consider further down the line too. But it isn't just children's services that have been affected. The Care Quality Commission has also said that adult social care run by Harrow Council requires improvement. That certainly didn't come as a huge surprise to many carers and elderly and other vulnerable adults in Harrow too. The council were ordered just last year to pay compensation to an elderly resident with dementia and her family who needed medical help after she was neglected and let down by the care home in which she'd been placed in by Harrow Council. Since 2022, Harrow Council has become the third most expensive council in London for council tax, behind Tory-run Croydon and Liberal Democrat-led Kingston upon Thames. Harrow's Conservative councillors have put council tax up by the maximum possible every year they've been in power and plan to continue doing so. A 20% rise in council tax since 2022, despite their promises to freeze council tax. Council tenants too have been hit with the maximum rent increases allowable in each of the past 4 years, while leaseholders' service charges have rocketed. I will give you one in a second. Astonishingly, some leaseholders in properties owned by Harrow Council are expecting to see their service charges rise by 70% this year. One family are currently paying £2,000 annually and have been sent a bill for £3,400 for next year. Those rates are simply unacceptable in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and I hope the Council will review them urgently. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. Does he believe that people who promise not to raise council tax should not raise council tax?
Well, I'm happy to say I think the Conservative councillors in Harrow Council who promised not to raise council tax and duly did so. And I hope the Honourable Gentleman will join me in urging the Shadow Secretary of State to ask perhaps the leader of his council to explain better to the people of Harrow why he reneged on his promise. But let me go on. Regeneration should be an opportunity to build more affordable and social housing, and as a result to help tackle the housing crisis that we face in communities such as my own. It should surely involve local communities and be thought through to create opportunities for communities to come together and to provide for key local services. Instead, the completion of the redevelopment of the Grange Farm estate has been delayed multiple times, again a product of lack of funding and poor leadership locally.
Would you give way on that point?
Yep.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is making an excellent point. I'm very sorry to hear about the challenges his residents have with their council. There are local authorities which are doing exactly the opposite. In my area, Reading Borough Council recently opened 46 new council houses built on their own land. 46 new council houses, part of a programme to build nearly 800. So there are local authorities which are able to grip this, and I'm very sad to hear about his situation in his council. Perhaps they could learn something from Reading and other peers around the country.
Well, certainly, I would welcome the chance of news that Conservative councillors in Harrow responsible for housing were going to look at positive councils committed to building more council homes, such as those in his constituency. But that failure does mean that residents have had to put up with mice, damp and substandard accommodation for too long on the Grange Farm estate. And on other regeneration schemes in Wealdstone, plans for affordable housing have been axed. No new council housing that hadn't already been planned by the previous council has been built. A primary school that was due to be provided, again, has been axed locally too. Developers are not being held properly to account, and a major opportunity to lift the quality of life in the borough has been missed. A consistent complaint I have heard, Madam Deputy Speaker, from constituents of mine is that they find it very difficult to get to see anyone at the council, that they don't know where to go to meet council staff to sort out problems and discuss issues in their neighbourhood. Shortly after the local Conservative Party took over running Harrow Council, they closed Harrow's Civic Centre. It was due to be replaced by a smaller set of council offices in Wealdstone on what's currently the Peel Road car park. It would have given access for Harrow residents to council staff and helped increase the number of people using businesses in the local high street. It would have freed up council-owned land for much-needed affordable housing, for new workspaces, new retail and commercial spaces, as well as a new primary school, a new library, a new park for residents to enjoy, and a new town square. Instead, that civic centre remains closed, derelict, boarded up. Major decisions on regeneration have been delayed or cancelled. No new set of accessible council offices are planned, and no one knows indeed when or indeed really if new promised housing will actually go ahead. Instead, local Conservative councillors have spent thousands of pounds doing up their own council offices, yet members of the public are not allowed in. If you'll forgive me, I've given way to him once. I'll let him hope to catch the Madam Deputy Speaker's eye and contribute later. The public will obviously get their say on the situation in Harrow in May, but I think the failures at Harrow Council do raise other questions. Reversing the decade and more of austerity for local services is clearly a priority, and the settlement that was announced in December makes a good start in that objective. Harrow certainly needs a serious examination of its funding formula going forward. But surely raising the quality of local services needs to be more than just the responsibility of local people. In 2015, the parties opposite took the decision to abolish the Audit Commission, a body which usefully challenged councils much earlier on, indeed, and helped prevent many poor management practices of the sort we're seeing on a regular basis in Harrow from being developed and getting out of control. Give way tomorrow.
For giving way, and I think he makes an excellent point. Rightly, this government is putting more money back into local government after many, many years, long overdue. But that money has to be well spent. And the story that he's described in Harrow, unfortunately, is quite similar to my experience and my residents' experience in Hillingdon. The independent auditors are quite damning about the council's budgeting approach. Millions of pounds misallocated, no opening and closing, balances well into the financial year. And very recently it was reported by the press that the council, in a secret deal, had written off a former Tory councillor's debt, all whilst applying for exceptional financial support from this government. So I completely agree with him. Don't we need more independent oversight and audit of local government finance?
We certainly need more independent oversight of the way in which Conservative councils in outer London are managing their finances. I'm completely with my honourable friend on that score. And the story of what has happened in Hillingdon, almost as bad as the situation that we're facing in Harrow over the last 4 years. The one bright spot has been the increase in finance that the Secretary of State has delivered for Harrow. We need a review of the funding formula for Harrow going forward. But I welcome the settlement that we have had and look forward to continuing to persuade him of the case for more funding in Harrow going forward.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Liberal Democrats in our manifesto call for multi-year settlements for local government, for freeing of councils to generate more revenue, including from more council tax on second homes, increased planning fees, and also called for an extra £2 billion on education, including special educational needs and disability. And it's right that funding for local government is rebuilt after the consequences of the 2008 crash and the famous letter left by the outgoing Labour government that they spent all the money and there was none left. So moves forward in those areas I mentioned by this settlement are welcome, they're positive, and we do welcome them. And the announcement that 90% of special educational needs disability service debts that councils have unavoidably built up will be met by central government also does begin to address the crisis in SEND, but I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, it doesn't finish the job. The promised SEND reforms have again been delayed, and whatever the outcome of those SEND reforms, they must not be a precursor to weakening the protection disabled children rely on and their parents expect. Our five tests would ensure that SEND reforms would guarantee children's rights to SEND assessment and support are maintained, and the voices of children and young people with SEND and their families and carers must remain at the centre of the reform process. Secondly, that capacity in state special school provision must be increased alongside improvements to inclusive mainstream. Thirdly, that national government must top up funding for each child whose needs exceed the local authority provision within a given cap. And the government must get on and introduce a cap on the profits made from private sector SEND companies. Early intervention, fourthly, must be improved and waiting times cut. And lastly, schools must be incentivised both to accept SEND pupils and to train their staff. The additional funds for housing and homelessness, while small, are also, of course, welcome, and including for the Somerset Council in my own constituency. And whilst the extra funding coming through the recovery grant is also welcome, I know that places like Kingston upon Hull are telling us it doesn't go far enough and won't fill the gaping hole in financial stability that persists. It's disappointing also that social housing does not get a mention in the settlement. We need a new generation of council and social rent homes. Our plans are 150,000 per year. Shelters are 90,000 per year. Both would be a good proposition. The government's proposed 18,000 per year just will not meet the level of need that's out there, Madam Deputy Speaker. The additional funding, along with provision for SEND deficits, does help enable councils like my own in Somerset to keep the council tax rise to 4.99% norm across the country. In a cost of living crisis, people cannot afford more than the minimum increase, something that Somerset MPs and the council pushed hard for, and I'm grateful to the local government minister for meeting with us and engaging with us on that. It's notable that 70 out of the 74 Liberal Democrat-led councils in the country have kept the council tax rise to the norm minimum of 4.99%. And of the 4 that are going exceptionally above that, they all inherited their from their previous Conservative administrations a council social care funding time bomb. And voters will take note that reform-led Worcestershire are taking the increase in council tax to the highest level allowed in the country. Typically, they are not here to take part in the debate on local government finance. The message is clear: reform, vote reform, and pay more than anyone else in the country in your taxes. I will give way to my dear friend.
Him giving way. He's giving a powerful speech outlining how Liberal Democrat councils up and down the country are doing their best in this cost of living crisis. Oxfordshire finds itself in a £24 million deficit as a result of this settlement. Meanwhile, we are getting residents on doors saying, "What about my potholes?" And he's right to point out that social care is part of that democratic deficit. Does he agree with me that we need to tackle the core issues here, and one of those is to sort out social care, because that helps everything to do with local government finance?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and Conservative members from a Senate petition are asking who runs the council, but I use the inherited time bomb word. I use it advisedly. The well-respected Conservative former leader of Somerset County Council, David Fothergill, was one of the first in the country to identify this. He told Panorama back in 2019 that adult social care was a time bomb which is ticking. That time bomb, Madam Deputy Speaker, has gone off around the country. Council taxpayers are having to bail out a broken social care system.
My right honourable friend give way. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way for Torbay Council, which I also still serve on. That there are unreasonable, well, incredible assumptions being made about the levels of council tax being collected. This results in, for a small unitary authority, a deficit of £13 million in year 2 and 3. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Labour Party have been learning from the Conservatives that they are planning to balance the books of councils on the backs of local taxpayers?
I certainly agree with my honourable friend who's championing Torbay on a regular basis in the Chamber that councils are suffering reductions in their funding settlement across the country, and that's one of the reasons we can't support this in the amount of support they're getting from central government. Yes.
Look, again, there's a memory loss going on over there, isn't there? In coalition, we had the biggest cuts to local government funding and the start of passing funding responsibilities over to the council tax system. That began with the Lib Dems in coalition. Why doesn't the honourable gentleman apologise to this chamber and to people up and down the country for what the Lib Dems did for them when they were in government?
It's a responsibility.
The honourable member of Sheffield South East is right that there were massive savings made after the financial crash in 2008. And some would say around £40 billion over the years of the coalition. He would be horrified to learn that the only people suggesting greater cuts than £41 billion were the Labour Party. In their 2010 manifesto, proposed £56 billion of cuts. He doesn't believe me. If he doesn't believe me, look at the headlines at the time. Alistair Darling, "We will cut deeper than Margaret Thatcher," said Alistair Darling in 2010 in his budget. Who began austerity? Who began the cuts? It was under the Labour government, and they were planning to go further, faster and deeper, according to Alistair Darling, than the Liberal Democrats or the coalition did. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman on that.
Just wanted to ask the honourable gentleman, does he agree with the words of the Labour leader of Sheffield, who says that cost pressures continue to outstrip increases in funding, both specific inflationary pressures in major service areas, particularly for care, accommodation and construction, and the increasing volume of demand for housing and care. Is the Labour leader of Sheffield correct?
I hesitate to get too involved in the politics of Sheffield, but I'm concerned that what we are seeing is government funding for all councils across the country being reduced, and particularly, if I may go on, to the case of rural authorities who are particularly hard hit by this settlement. They find delivering social care and other services far more costly than in tightly drawn urban areas. Somerset's 4,000-mile road network, for example, is a massively more onerous proposition than a tightly drawn urban area. It's inexplicable that despite consultation, that considered maintaining the remoteness funding uplift across the country and across all funding heads of local government, it's been taken away from all funding heads apart from adult social care. Why is it less costly to provide children's services than it is adult services in a remote rural area? Why is it less costly to provide flood relief and flood protection in a rural area than than it is to provide services to adults? A whole range of really remote authorities are affected. Westmoreland and Furness, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, all are particularly badly hit. Remote authorities have much greater areas to protect from flooding as well, as I say. And I have to tell the Minister that, having spent yesterday and recent days with families in Staithe and Boroughbridge in my constituency on the Somerset levels, I've seen how heartrending it is for them as they watch the water coming closer and closer to their homes. 200 metres when you go to bed, when you see the water 200 metres away, can be only 20 metres when you wake up the next morning and look out through your window. And for some houses I visited, the water is lapping up against the houses themselves. And when Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron came down last time we had severe flooding in 2013-14, he promised to Somerset money would be no object. It turned out he meant that Somerset residents' money would be no object, because Somerset's New Rivers Authority became the only one in the country not to be funded by central government and to rely on local taxpayers. The flooding minister came down to Somerset yesterday and said that Somerset will not be forgotten. So I'd like to ask the local government minister what extra support the minister is providing to Somerset Council to deal with a flooding major incident, one which could easily become a national emergency if effective measures are not taken now, and I mean in the next few days. The water levels are still rising, Minister. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need an end to the massive expense of all this top-down, costly reorganisation of local government where people don't want it. Forcing change on the structures of natural communities people know and love can only distract from the work, the important work, reducing flooding, delivering care, and all the other priorities that councils put first. No one I've met in Taunton, Wellington, or Somerset, or on the levels, told me what they really want to see is a metro-style mayor come down the road for their area. Spending almost £500 million on mayors, is that really going to help any of our constituencies in ways that known, understood and strengthened local councils would do? While we welcome the limited extra funding this settlement leaves too many questions unanswered on how send costs will be met, it is still going to lead to big cuts in services for rural and remote authorities, and on social care it leaves council taxpayers bailing out a broken system. For all these reasons, we cannot at this stage support this settlement.
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State, who's not in his place, for opening this debate on the settlement. I know the work that he has led on, and the Minister who's here in terms of bringing forward this statement and being strong voices for our local government colleagues. I should declare that obviously the Secretary of State and I served both at Lambeth Council, and the Minister served as a councillor in Southwark, in one of my neighbouring boroughs. And also to pay tribute to the former minister, the member for Oldham West, Chedderton and Royton, for the work that he did with many councils in terms of making sure we are at this place. I know that many local authorities across England will be delighted to see that the government is covering the 90% of debts built up through supporting children with special education needs and disabilities. This is an issue that comes into all our inboxes, regardless of which council's at political lead. It's a big issue that's been ongoing for many councils, and it's about how we continue to support some of the most vulnerable children who need to ensure that councils are adequately funded in terms of those areas. And if we're honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, these costs are not of the council's making, but if the Shadow Secretary Straight highlighted, it is as a result of the broken system which finally this government is addressing, and I hope the government will continue to address in the upcoming schools white paper. Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the first things that everyone across local government asks for is certainty from the government. Certainty so that authorities can make the long-term investment in the infrastructure. Certainty that they can have the funding to build the homes that we need. Certainty that they can start turning around. I know members don't like to hear it, but the 14 years of underinvestment in local government, the underinvestment in SEN, the underinvestment in temporary accommodation, the underinvestment in adult social care. So we should all welcome the first multi-year settlement in a decade, ending that year-on-year waiting game that held back that investment for too long. And this is something that's been called for not just by the current Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee that I chaired, but also the predecessor committee chaired by my wonderful colleague, the member for Sheffield South East. And it's good to see that this government is finally listening on that. So we do welcome a reduction in the number of grants, where you see a situation where we are asking our cash-strapped councils to continue to bid for small pots of money. That's officer time taken away from frontline services, bidding for those pots where in some cases they may not even be successful. That is not a good use of vital officers' time. And it's a case of, in some cases, those councils had to justify submitting those bids in the first place. So we really do welcome this really crucial area. But there are two areas that I want to focus on in the short time that I have. One is around the fact that many members and right honourable members have already raised it this afternoon. The reality is, even with this funding, welcomed funding, a number of councils are still going to face budgetary issues. The Local Government Association anticipates that more councils may be applying for exceptional financial support. We have to ask ourselves, when you see more councils applying for that emergency funding, there is nothing exceptional about it. We cannot have a situation where councils are having to rely on emergency funding so that they can carry out day-to-day services and they don't effectively declare bankruptcy. So I hope that the government will be looking at this area going forward. I will give way to my colleague.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the honourable friend for giving way. I agree with what she's saying. I'm very concerned that the government's support package for councils like Woking Borough Council, which went effectively bankrupt several years ago following Conservative mismanagement, is by allowing them to borrow more money to pay off the government loans. Does he agree that EFS needs to change immediately?
I thank the honourable member, an excellent colleague on our cross-party select committee, and I think this is an area that we did look at on the select committee with our report in terms of local government finance. And our committee, he will remember, quote, stated that we have to look at the capitalisation direction and the stopgap measures that avoid Section 114 notices that allow councils to produce short-term balanced budgets but can weaken councils' finances and capital investments in the long term. So there is an issue. We cannot keep burying this issue under the carpet and thinking that it's going to go away. It is not. In the long term, we are building more debts for these councils, and we have to look at how we address that. So I am pleased that this is something that the government are going to be looking at and making sure councils that are applying for ESF, we're having a whole-scale root and branch review of how that money is being allocated. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that this multi-year funding and process won't solve the underlying issues facing all our councils. And another area which the Minister knows that I've mentioned on many occasions, and there is growing cross-party support on this, is that at the heart of this, there's the reliance on the most regressive form of taxation to pay for those mandatory demand-led services where councils, in any effect, have little control over that demand. Council tax, as we know, amounts to about half of the settlement total. And it also assumes a maximum increase across the board, despite the fact that the government has little control on how much that figure will actually be. And the Secretary of State highlighted that in boroughs where the referendum principle will be lifted, the government is assuming that increasing council tax will help, with some councils having to increase their council tax by over 30% just to reach the core spending powers and the figures in this settlement. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I think all of us understand the challenges the government's facing when it comes to balancing the books and the inheritance which they were left with, followed by the 14 years. And they are difficult decisions that we have to make. But equally, I want to go back to one of our evidence sessions when the former member, the member for Oldham West, told our committee, and I quote, that there is a real danger to the democratic process if there is not a link between the tax that people are paying for services and the quality of services they are getting in return.
On exactly this point about the democratic point, is that in Worcestershire, my constituents were promised by the Reform candidates that they would actually cut council tax. It's a shame that not a single Reform Member of Parliament has turned up to defend what they've done. But the council tax is going up, Worcester council tax is going up by 9%. But the worrying point is that we're being denied a referendum because it goes above the 5% threshold, and that bit of the democratic process has been removed from Worcestershire.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and I agree. I think many residents who are feeling a pinch, who are seeing, in essence, yes, we've seen fantastic initiatives, new legislation come through from this government, but that's not trickling down quickly enough. Many residents will be seeing their council tax bills in the next few months, and for a number of residents, those bills will be going up. So I think it is important that we look at that link and that democratic link, because we have
Chairman of the Committee for giving way. A £200,000 house in the East Riding of Yorkshire, depending on its 91 valuation, will be paying between £3,000 and £4,000 in council tax, a £200,000 house. A £2 million flat in Westminster will be paying £2,000. There's an opportunity to put that right. I know she's from London, the Secretary of State's from London. It feels to a lot of us out in the provinces like everybody in charge is from London. That is so egregious and wrong. And does the Chairman of the Committee not agree that something needs to be done about it? We didn't do it in our years in office, and the government said they would have a fairer system now. It's not fair.
Florence Eshalomi.
I thank the right honourable member for that intervention. I think it's fair to say successive governments have put the issue of council tax in a too difficult box. And it will, I'm hoping that will fall on this government to finally address that and make sure that we bring an end to this regressive form of taxation.
On that point, would the honourable member give way? I'll give way. I thank the honourable member, my honourable friend, for giving way. Would she agree with me that the work that has been done on the draft local government settlement to get us to this final local government settlement has actively put the principles of fairer funding into place? My local authority in Sandwell, the 5th most deprived local authority in the country, is getting an extra £28 million as a result of the continuation and the increase of the recovery grant. That money will go on crucial services that we were deprived of in my area during 14 years of Conservative austerity. I know my honourable friend will want to join with me in welcoming the work that has been done by the local government minister, by our friends in the Treasury, to make sure that the principles of fairer funding were put into place. Florence Eshalomi.
I thank my honourable friend, who's a doughty champion for her constituency and her council's needs. And I think it's fair to say that the outdated and opaque previous funding settlement caused a number of issues for councils up and down the country, and it's finally good to see this government responding to that and making sure we have a fairer settlement, a more simplified settlement, so that our councils can get on with a day job of providing those vital services for our residents. And just to wrap up, Madam Deputy Speaker, going back to the issue of council tax, we have a situation where we have to be honest and ask that if councils have to impose a council tax hike just to fulfil mandatory services, going back to the question the honourable member raised, where is that democratic choice for residents? If council tax is collected locally, how can it be right that what it is largely spent on is dictated by central government. And we know from this settlement today that the Secretary of State and the Minister have shown a boldness in making sure they continue to engage with local leaders. They continue to engage with the Local Government Association. They continue to engage with cross-party colleagues and cross-party councils to get to grips with the day-to-day issues facing local government. But I urge the Minister that they need to continue on this road of being bold. They need to continue working, especially with Treasury colleagues, to properly address the growing demand on the mandatory costs that councils are facing from SEND, adult social care, temporary accommodation. These will continue to grow no matter how much money the government puts into these core services. There is a real need for a fundamental review of council tax and wider council funding. I urge the government to go further and bring in cross-party consensus on this and to truly reform council tax and bring an end to this regressive form of taxation once and for all.
James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This settlement is supposed to deliver fair funding. That's what the formula says on the tin, but it fails the Ronseal test. For Norfolk, its core spending power in the first year of the settlement is lower than the national average, and the largest increases in core spending power are going to urban authorities. This simply fails to recognise the need of large rural counties such as Norfolk. The County Council networked assessment is that rural county and unitaries face the highest pressures, collectively amounting to £7 billion of costs by 28-29. Give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I appreciate the concerns he's raising, but as a member in a constituency that is in outer London, that for very long has been deemed as having the inner London support through finance, but actually having inner London problems in the outer London borough, where it is not particularly leafy, where deprivation is tough and taking a massive toll on our councils. Can he understand that addressing those things, addressing deprivation, addressing the costs of housing, addressing things like temporary accommodation are crucial for places like mine?
Absolutely. James Watt.
Indeed, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady, if she catches your eye, Madam Deputy Speaker, will elaborate on that. My point is about, coming on to the point about remoteness, I think this is perhaps the kernel of the unfairness. It's the lack of recognition of remoteness and its impact beyond the adjustment for adult social care. It's been removed from most of the formulae. And this is a serious cost pressure. I won't give way, there's lots of people want to speak. This is a serious cost pressure on rural authorities, which the government has chosen to ignore. Of course, this is compounded by the removal of the Rural Service Delivery Grant in 2025. Its removal meant the loss of funding that was specifically put in place to recognise the high cost of rural service delivery. And this is a political choice made by a very political Secretary of State. And people in Norfolk can see in plain sight how this government views rural areas, coming after the farm tax, after lower bus funding that the last government put in place, scrapping road and rail schemes in our area. I asked the Minister, who's not in her place, so I hope the whip on the bench will make a note of why did ministers reject the evidence that Norfolk and other rural authorities put in about the additional costs that they face and the importance of remoteness. And after remoteness, there is the recovery grant, supposed to be a one-off formula intended to give local authorities the funding that they need. And then the formula is meant to replace it, but actually the government has decided to continue it for the next 3 years. But no funding for Norfolk County Council, despite the allocation and the additional element in the final settlement supposedly being targeted at upper-tier authorities. Apparently, it seems only if you're a Labour upper-tier authority. And little wonder that the Institute for Fiscal Studies said maintaining allocations of recovery grant does not look like a principled decision. I think that says it all. It's designed to shovel funding to Labour councils. And let's be clear, this is about shifting resources away from rural areas to unitaries. Yeah.
Can I thank my friend for giving way and declare my interest as a Central Bedfordshire councillor? Central Bedfordshire is going to have to find £17 million off the back of this so-called fairer funding formula. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this is nothing short of pork barrel politics?
Yeah.
James Wild.
I do agree with that, and the figures simply bear that out. And as a result of the settlement, it's probably the same for my honourable friend's constituents. It's council taxpayers in Norfolk who are going to bear the brunt of this through much higher council tax, and maximum council tax increases are assumed for the full 3 years of the settlement. I want to touch on the topic of internal drainage boards, which, Madam Deputy Speaker, you'll know are responsible for managing water levels and reducing flood risk, and they play a vital national role in protecting key areas, including prime agricultural land, so important for our food security. Yet the cost of IDBs falls on local council taxpayers. In the borough of Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, 40% of the council tax raised by the council goes to IDB levies, costs that other authorities do not face. And given the nationally important role, the funding should reflect that. And there has been additional support introduced by the last Conservative government and continued by this government. But this government is not operating that with inflation, taking account of the higher energy costs that IDBs are paying either. And if that support, we don't know if that's going to continue in future years, and if it doesn't, will the Minister commit to working with groups of local authorities, district authorities set up precisely to find an equitable solution to that? And of course, Norfolk is losing out yet further due to the Labour government's decision to cancel the Norfolk and Suffolk mayoral election, as well as the county council election. Two political choices I fundamentally disagree with. And my constituents were due, and those in Suffolk were due to get an annual investment fund of £37.4 million a year. But not only are our elections scrapped, the government has cut the amount of that investment fund that Norfolk will get. We are going to lose out on £48 million in the next 2 years. Why? Because of decisions taken by these ministers. Another sign of the neglect that this government has for the people of Norfolk. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do welcome the announcements on the SEND deficits, but overall it's clear this is not a fair funding settlement. There's an over-reliance on council tax increases for my constituents, no recognition of the true costs that rural authorities play, and ministerial decisions locking in inequalities for years to come. And the ministers and the government should think again.
Mary Rimmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Life in my constituency in St Helens and Whiston is tough for many families. Too many live with the daily consequences of poverty, ill health and insecurity, many vulnerable. The impact can be soul-destroying. Average life expectancy in my constituency is 50 in Knowsley, and I'm sure my honourable friend here from Knowsley, whose whole constituency is in Knowsley, I wish to pay tribute to her for the run that she made at Christmas time. And she was the one that really started our campaign. And I pay tribute to you. The life expectancy in Knowsley is 50. St Helens, which is most of my constituency, is 57, both for men and women. The call for significant health care and support is tremendous and starts much earlier. It was a shock when I saw those figures, when I read them. In St Helens, health and social care is integrated, and that has helped with the demands that come increasingly. Many children do not benefit from the dancing classes, gymnastics, excitement, trips out or holidays. Many, sadly, are lured to county lines and drug taking. Many of our children need special education provision. Some wait for a special, unique service. The cost can be enormous, and provision rare and very often not local. These children lose out. Their families watch and worry whilst waiting for the solution to arrive. Revenue support grant was always complex, mysterious, hard to nail down. Added to this, 14 years of austerity didn't help. St Helens Council lost £127 million. We were capped in poll tax. We'd only put the rates up 2%. I was the leader at the time. But we was one of 21 that was capped. We had to deliver over 10 million overnight, or we would have been surcharged. You had 3 months to deliver a new brand. We were very poor in St Helens. Our councils are struggling. Our councils are struggling to meet statutory responsibility in social care, SEND provision, not because of inefficiency in the councils, because families does not, the funding does not, bears no resemblance to the actual on the ground people and the lives that they have to put up with. Ever-growing numbers with complex needs, higher costs, lack of provision. 2/3 of St Helens Council's funding is spent on adult social care and children. 2/3. And we lost £127 million from government. I think it's about, I don't know, it's 9 or 11 million left. That's what we have. I won't go on to say, when I saw the need for the settlement that addresses the real pressures, we need that. I've always said that. Health, disabled, carers, attention, safeguarding, protecting the vulnerable, the aged and abused children in need. Due to the council gets money from income from the government, very little now. It's all fallen on council tax. It's fallen on the council tax. More and more efficiency. You couldn't get more efficient councils than Knowsley and St Helens. I'll go to the Knowsley meetings, I go to St Helens. I've been a councillor at St Helens for 39 years and I praise what I see in Knowsley because it's just so efficient, so focused on the people, and not the people that working inside, the good employers, but on the people and how we compare and serve for them. Due to the deprivation of our area, the lack of assets that can be sold that other councils have, we can only raise a fraction of what councils in the South East, London and the cities do. So there's very much we can get from that. So it's all revenue, it's all on the council tax and our ability to be more efficient, look for different ways and everything. It's ingenious to watch what does happen. The settlement we were first presented with would have brought what we were consulted on, seemed fair and good. And I have to say, when it came out, the provisional announcement just before Christmas, I was horrified. I was horrified. Housing had been introduced. Well, housing is into the IMD, index multiple deprivation. It's that we're not suffering from that deprivation in Knowsley and St Helens. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be there, but certainly not with the weighting that it's got, because that's where our money went. We went down from the first thing that we were consulted on, like that. We would have been in, St Helens would have been high and dry. I'm not going into the details. My honourable friend here, I got the figures from Knowsley. I got the same figures from Knowsley, what impact it was going to be. I knew St Helens would be bad, but couldn't get the figures. And my honourable friend, my friend here, went off and started the work off. And we did what we could till we got things going more. So it's, although it's first called fair funding, it isn't fair funding because we're all different. You know, I listen to what you're saying about people living in the rural districts. I have sympathy for you. And we need to have a system that really does look at what costs are the highest, what's needed. But no one can criticise the people that have got this extra funding now. But it's not there forever. Following the sustained lobbying, we've got 90% off our high needs deficit. High needs deficit is the deficit we've got on SEND provision. And Knowsley's is tremendous, far much greater than St Helens. So that will help. That does help. And it's just wonderful what goes on. The recovery grant, we will get 14.7 million over the 3 years. But that doesn't resolve the problem because it's not part of the formula. And we will have to commence straight away to look at what we're going to do, because we would have been much worse off than we were already before it. So that's just one council, and I know there'll be others like that. So we do need to look at that thing. But I would pay tribute to the work that has gone on by the ministers. It's been the local authorities, the work in the chambers of the finance departments, the work the MPs, the work the councillors have done, and the work that the ministers have done. It can't have been pleasant for them to see what they saw. And I know that having looked at it, they've recognised things. But we will need to look at this for funding in the future. But I do thank sincerely all those that's been involved in coming to some help for some of the worst affected boroughs in the country. It's not been party political, I can assure you of that. We don't think like that. I certainly don't, and I know this lady doesn't, know this gentleman is here. Our benches are full of council leaders from our areas, former council leaders. We've got more years as that. I've been in local government and this for 48 years. And I know what I'm talking about, but I see what I'm talking about. It's not made up. So I will be supporting this tonight, but it doesn't mean the end of the lobbying. We will obviously start again. And I'm sure the ministers will listen to what other people said, and maybe there does need to be flexing here and flexing there, but we need to recognise each area and what their needs are. We can't lead them to deprivation and deny their needs. Thank you.
Manuela Perteghella.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I am incredibly proud to have been a councillor until last year, because local government is the foundation of so much that matters in people's daily lives. It keeps our streets clean, supports vulnerable families, funds social care, maintains roads, protects our environment, and makes sure children can get to school safely, keeps our bins emptied, and not everywhere, but keeps our potholes filled. And when councils are stretched to breaking point, it is residents who feel the strain. I welcome the move to a multi-year settlement, which is something we have long argued for. Councils need certainty, they need to plan beyond a single financial year, and that stability matters. But let us be clear, a longer settlement does not in itself fix a broken system. The Public Accounts Committee has warned that deficits could reach nearly 4 billion a year by 2027 to 28, and that is not sustainable. And on top of that, we now have rising demand, inflationary pressures, increases in the national living wage, and the hike in national insurance contributions. And councils are expected to absorb all of these. Further, making any material changes and for example, in the assumption or level of business rates pooling, and effectively reducing councils' funding allocation between the provisional and final settlement will cause serious challenges for many councils, including Stratford-on-Avon District Council, which could see a big cut to 5% or more of the council's total spending power. So if I heard correctly, the Secretary of State pledged to refund those councils affected by this material change, and I would like the government benches to confirm that. Our constituents are the ones who are going to be impacted, and the provision of valuable local services will be affected. I am deeply concerned about the impact on rural areas like mine in Stratford-on-Avon. The shift to a need and demand model risks overlooking the real costs of delivering services across large, sparsely populated areas. Rural councils often receive less grant funding, yet face higher transport costs, greater recruitment challenges, and weaker public transport networks. That reality must be properly recognised in any fair funding formula. In my own constituency, I see the pressures on local government every day. Stratford-on-Avon District Council, led by the Liberal Democrats, has shown what responsible local leadership looks like, even in tough times. It has delivered the third highest recycling rate in England. It has rolled out natural flood management. It has installed solar panels on leisure centres to cut running costs and reduce emissions. It has allocated 600,000 to a cost of living mitigation fund to support our most vulnerable families. That is practical, sensible, community-focused governance. That is what can be achieved when councils are run competently and with a clear sense of purpose. Contrast that with the chaos we have seen at Warwickshire County Council, now run by Reform. Last week, after a grueling 10-hour meeting, the minority Reform administration failed to pass a budget. The Liberal Democrats put forward an alternative that would have invested £20 million in tackling child poverty, protecting youth services, improving home-to-school transport, and investing in infrastructure for the future. For an extra 39p a week, we could have protected services for thousands of young people and vulnerable residents. Instead, Reform doubled down on cuts that would hit families hard, including changes that could leave children walking up to 5 miles to school, often along unlit rural roads. Reform and the Conservatives combined to block that investment, and then still could not agree a budget of their own, leaving the council in limbo. This story Reform stitch-up is costing residents in Stratford-on-Avon and across Warwickshire. As we look ahead to local government reorganisation in Warwickshire, these choices matter even more. Stratford-on-Avon District Council has made... Yes, I will.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I'd like to touch on the point around reform councils and the promises that they made and the reality of that. In Lancashire, they're trying to balance the books by initially consulting on closing 10 care homes and day centres, narrowing that down now to just the day centres. And would the honourable member be as surprised as me to see them not here to defend their record of what they promised versus the reality of a reform-led council?
Exactly.
Thank the honourable member for his intervention. Yes, I mean the reform benches are empty, as we all can see, as the British public can see, and this is really important because and this is important because as I said, local government is the foundation of our places. They give us a civic pride in our areas. They really are the front line of delivering services, and is really disappointed. And there is chaos in Warwickshire. We are still without a budget. And as we look ahead to local government reorganisation, these choices, as I was saying, matter even more. Stratford-on-Avon District Council has made a clear case for a South Warwickshire unitary that reflects real communities and keeps decision-making closer to residents. Reform are pushing for a single county-wide super authority that would centralise power and move it farther away from local people. At a time when trust in politics is fragile, we should be strengthening local democracy, not weakening it. We must keep local government local. Madam Deputy Speaker, local authorities are ready to play their part in delivering growth, tackling the climate emergency, insulating homes, improving air quality, building the infrastructure our communities need. But they cannot do so if they're permanently firefighting. If we're serious about strong communities and a strong economy, we must get local government finance right and not defund rural councils. We need to support them so that they can deliver for the residents, rather than leaving them to pick up the pieces of national government failure. Thank you.
Clive Betts.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all, could I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and my friend, the Local Government Minister, for this settlement. It's a welcome change. I also thank the Minister's predecessor, the right honourable member for Oldham, for the work he did, both in opposition and then in government, to get us to this better place. To say, I'm now Deputy Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and we did a report about local government funding recently. Just to read what the conclusions were, cross-party. Local government finance is in a perilous state. The funding has not kept pace with population growth, demand for services, complexity of need, or the rising costs of delivering services. As demand for targeted services such as social care, special education needs and temporary accommodation has grown, there has been a significant reduction in spending on commonly used discretionary services such as street cleaning, lighting, parks and gardens and leisure services. That's the truth that councils up and down the country have known and experienced and had to deal with over many, many years. And I would at this point to congratulate councillors of all parties, in all councils across the country, for how they performed during the years of austerity, how they've continued to work and deliver efficiencies, which perhaps some central government departments, as the PSC could testify, would do well to emulate. Of course, I give my word.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State and his ministerial team for listening to my representations and those of my council. My experience, to be fair, of Tory Secretary of State listening, let alone acting, is about as rare as rocking horse dung, frankly. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the party opposite, who didn't fund local government properly for 14 years, are now the ones who are complaining and whinging about the position we're in? Isn't that their responsibility, not this government's responsibility?
Yes. Absolutely, and I think that goes for both parties opposite as well, as my honourable friend would understand. The situation that this government's faced is clearly a serious one. Let's say they've got some things very right indeed. First of all, the multi-year settlement, which I think has been called for cross-party. Certainly the Select Committee over many years, and the Select Committee now has called for it, and it's good that we have one. It gives that degree of certainty for local councils to look at the future and be able to plan ahead. Fair funding. Now, fair funding is always a subjective term for what on one side is fair funding, the other side will say isn't. But I just point out to the opposition that I think it was Greg Clark, who was the Secretary of State for HCLG at the time, 10 years ago promised a fair funding review by the then government. We're still waiting for it in 2024. So they had their chance and they didn't do it. We've now got a review to deal with the simple matters that some of the figures, some of the data in the funding settlement were 20 years old and more.
Tash Ryans. I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point. And again, I'd like to join colleagues in thanking the Secretary of State and the Minister for their work on this, because when you're talking about outdated data, places like Croydon East in my constituency were treated like we had an endless pot of cash as an outer London borough and that we were endlessly wealthy, when actually the pockets of deprivation in my constituency are some of the highest in the country, and this funding formula seeks to address that. So would you agree with me that this new fresh approach, an end to Tory austerity, is exactly what our councils need?
I certainly do, and it's an next point I was going to make, that in the funding settlement, deprivation is properly recognised. Yeah. Because that's the problem for councils who've got deprivation, either in total or in part, over many years, have taken the burden of the cuts. What happened under the previous government, both the Coalition and the Conservatives, was that those councils with the greatest needs, which previously had the largest grants to reflect those needs, then had the biggest cuts. That's what happened. And what this funding settlement does is to give the biggest increases to those councils which previously had the biggest cuts under the last government. You know, we're getting some restoration for the funding reductions that previously we suffered. The recovery grant is right because councils need recovery where they've had their funding base decimated simply because they've had the grants that were previously needed taken away from them. My one challenge, I think, to my right honourable friend, the Minister, is that the recovery grant lasts, I think, for 3 years. In 2029, there is a danger of a cliff edge where suddenly those councils who get it now could suddenly lose it. So I think there is an issue there that, thinking ahead, as the Minister is obviously trying to do for a change from previous ministers, let's start to think about that problem before it comes and hits us. So I welcome the settlement from Sheffield's point of view. I think the comments made by the leader of the council, which actually is a cross-party council, the leader of the council were about the concerns and challenges the council had faced prior to this funding settlement. I'll just read out what the finance director of Sheffield Council said about the settlement. The figures announced in the settlement back up the government's commitment to redressing the unequal cuts seen during the austerity years of the previous government and its aim to deliver more funding to the deprived areas of the country. I think that's a fair statement from the council officer in Sheffield responsible for the council's finances. So Sheffield's got about 55 billion more than was anticipated under the previous proposals in this funding settlement over 3 years. That just sort of fills the hole that we've been making cuts in the past in essential services. It means for the first time in 15 years we could start a budget process without immediately looking at cuts in essential services. First time in 15 years. 1 year after another of cuts. That's been the situation, and we've now got a situation where the budget can be balanced without those cuts. That's a real fundamental change. And start to look at maybe some improvements, some preventative measures for the future, which bring about the sort of change we all want to see. Well done to the government for getting us to that position. Another well done, dealing with the ring fences. Not just ring fences in the Minister's own department, but across government, whether it be transport or health or education. There are ring fences all round which restrict local councillors' ability to do the right thing for their communities. So it's good that the government's moved in that direction. I know the Select Committee now and previous Select Committee has called for that, and the government have really been listening to that. To be fair, under when Secretary of State Michael Gove was there was an agreement that needed to happen, but not much evidence that it did happen. So I think we've moved in a direction which everyone wants to see. So I'll say to the Secretary of State, this is a good start. It steadies the ship in terms of the cuts that those councils with high levels of deprivation have had to suffer, and it brings a strong element of fairness to the settlement. Now I'm going to bring the challenge to the Minister. I know she wouldn't expect me not to be completely complimentary in what I'm going to say. And I come back to the point that the Chair of the Select Committee made about the need for change. This is a good start, but there's now need for radical change. We came in with a manifesto of change. We've got a large majority, and with a willingness we can deliver on it. There are the major issues of social care. I'm disappointed still that we're not going to make changes to social care funding till 2029 after the review. I think we could do it more quickly. We're clearly moving on SEND. We've got to move on children's social care as well. There is something that some councils can do to help themselves, like Warrington Council, who start to build their own children's home, so they don't have to send children to very expensive private homes. Yes.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for Sheffield South East, who's generous with his time. We may not agree on the cuts that began in 2009, but on the topics that he's raising, he hasn't yet touched on the remoteness, the removal of the remoteness uplift. Does he agree, in a cross-party spirit, that including a remoteness uplift just for adult social care, but not for children, not for any other services, must be contrary to common sense and affects remote rural authorities more than others across the country?
I'm not going to go through every detail of this settlement. It's always a balance, local government settlements, that ministers have to come to a judgment about. What I would say overall, and it's the overall impact that I think I want to judge it by, to me this is a fairer settlement for those authorities with high levels of deprivation that suffered the worst cuts under the years of austerity. I will.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Talk about whether this is a fair settlement. I think if we look on balance, we will find that if we look at the number of councils that have Labour constituencies are the ones that are benefiting from this, and the councils that are represented on this side are not, and the fairness can be derived from that.
It's always possible. First of all, of course, there are a lot more councils with Labour MPs. That's the initial start. But of course, it might just be the point that Labour MPs represent councils with higher levels of deprivation. That might be a simple explanation that one could draw from it. Right.
I'd just like to add to that standing here as an MP with a Conservative council, I've had a colleague from Conservative Croydon Council. They cheer. Unfortunately, it's a bankrupt Tory council, but luckily this government is stepping in, and despite it being a Tory council, has followed the deprivation and the need and is properly funding it, regardless of political colour.
Absolutely. Council should be funded according to need, not according to political representation. But before members opposite start, I don't know whether members opposite are old enough to remember Dame Shirley Porter and Westminster Council and how they were stuffed with money over visitor nights just to keep the Conservative victory at the local elections. But we'll move on from that. That's a long time ago. What I would say to my honourable friend on the front bench, there are these big challenges that do need to be addressed, and we've got to get to grips with them. Yeah. We also have a local government finance system which is fundamentally broken. And the Select Committee Chair has commented that in her very excellent speech a few moments ago. The Select Committee in the last Parliament made the same recommendations. How can you continue to fund a local authority system in the modern age with a council tax system based on valuations in 1991? It is a nonsense. It's not sustainable. You go to someone in a new house and say, how did they arrive at the value of my house? Well, it's what it was worth in 1991. But my house has only just been built. I know, but they have a guess of what it would have been worth if it had been built then. Look, this is ridiculous, and we've got to change it. It's also regressive. Michael Gove, Secretary of State, said the system was regressive, and it is. The poorer households pay disproportionately more in council tax. It simply is not fair. And every year, of course, has been going on since 2010. Council tax has taken a higher and higher share of the local government funding. Therefore, what we're doing is placing a greater and greater burden on that part of the funding settlement, which is regressive. And when the Chancellor made the commitments during the election campaign not to increase certain taxes, council tax was omitted. So council tax has been going up disproportionately, an unfair, regressive tax hitting the poorest hardest. We simply have to do something about that. And it comes back to the democracy point that the Chair of the Select Committee made. While this is going on and poor families are having to pay disproportionately more, but in terms of local government spending, more is going on social care and homelessness and special education needs, the things which are really important, which most people don't receive. Then most people, particularly those on lower incomes, are paying more tax every year and getting less in services because of the cuts to other services, as the PAC recognised. That's not sustainable. It undermines the trust in local authorities. People say to me, the council put my council tax up and I'm getting less for it. Yeah. It really has to change this. We can't do it. I will. Yes, okay.
Brash.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for giving way to my honourable friend. In Hartlepool, 70% of every penny the council spends is on social care. And my constituents pay, as a proportion of their property value, as a proportion of their income, far, far more than more affluent areas of the country, and as he's rightly said, do not receive the services that they need. Is it not time to abolish the council tax system?
I think time to reform it so fundamentally it wouldn't be recognisable for what we've got now, and that's the way we've got to try and move forward. Along with business rates, we promised business rate reform, Madam Speaker. I'm sorry, what we've had so far is not reform, it's some minor changes. Yes, good changes to try and help with pubs and leisure facilities, but it isn't fundamental reform. We need a we could look at what both Denmark and Australia have done to reform their whole system of council finances based on land values. That's one alternative, but let's at least have a look. Let's at least accept there is a need for change, even if we can't agree precisely at this point what the change would be. And in bringing about that change, I say to my honourable friend, the Minister, let's look at giving local authority more power to actually determine their own levels of taxation. We are an outlier in Europe about how centralised our local government finance system is. That's another challenge. It partly comes before the great inequalities we have in this country, much greater than most other European countries between different parts of our country. And I welcome the ability of councils to be able to put on a tourism tax, but that's a really minute step in a move towards more say for local councils about the money they can raise. A very small step. Welcome, but very small. So I just say to the Minister, really well done on the reforms and improvements to the existing system. It's really welcome. My city, my constituents welcome that. But the big challenges lie ahead now about some more fundamental reform of the system and more powers back to local council in determining the money they raise. I say to the Minister, you probably won't agree with that today. You probably won't stand at the dispatch box and say, we completely agree, we're going to get on with it. But at least start thinking about it.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief, and they will be focused on council tax. And the reason they will be brief is because I was hoping to intervene earlier on the Secretary of State, who said he didn't want to dodge difficult topics and wanted to talk about promises. He didn't take an intervention because he probably knew what was coming. I want to talk about broken promises, and I want to talk about difficult topics. The primary one being, affecting my residents right now across Bromsgrove in the villages, in fact across Worcestershire, is the government's collusion with Reform to hike the council tax by a staggering 9%. That will be the highest council tax increase that Worcestershire County Council will have imposed on its residents. I believe it will likely be the highest increase in council tax across the country this year. And it's reprehensible, Madam Deputy Speaker, because prior to the general election in 2024, the Labour Party stood very clearly on a manifesto that said they would freeze council tax. And they know, as well as I do, that they have no will to deliver that. That the political difficulty... I won't give way because the Secretary of State wouldn't give way to me. The Secretary of State wouldn't give way to me, so I'm not going to give way and listen. I'm not going to give way and be lectured to by Labour MPs who are not upholding their promises, Madam Deputy Speaker. So the government stood on a manifesto to freeze council tax, knowing full well that they would not be able to deliver that. But worse still, last May, prior to the local elections, the Reform Party stuffed leaflets through the doors of residents across Worcestershire, indeed across the country, pledging that they would cut council tax. Now, they spoke about this Doge programme of local government efficiency. It's very interesting that there's not a single Reform Member of Parliament here in the Chamber today to defend their record. And with this Doge programme, well, where is it? Why has it revealed nothing? They thought that they were going to be able to turn the sofa upside down, give it a good shake, £100 million would fall out of it. Well, that didn't happen. But I can tell you what did happen in Worcestershire since last May. £100 million has been the overspend from the Reform administration. And as a result, they've come cap in hand to this government for emergency funding and for a council tax rise in excess, way in excess of inflation and way in excess of the 5% threshold for a referendum. I will give way to my honourable friend and neighbour.
I'm incredibly grateful to my honourable friend and neighbour, He's raising incredibly... Sorry, my apologies, he's raising incredibly important points about how our constituents were promised that they would have a cut in council tax and have been royally let down by the Reform councillors. But can I embarrass my honourable friend? It's worth remembering that there are a lot of Conservative district councils do very well, and my honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove, was the leader of Wychavon District Council over the last 14 years, where for 5 years it was deemed the most financially resilient district council in the country, and at the same time didn't see a single penny increase in council tax. That is what Conservative councils deliver.
I thank my honourable friend and neighbour. He is far too generous. I was leader of Wychavon District Council in South Worcestershire for 5 years, where we proudly froze council tax for 5 years consistently without cutting a single service. Local government is lean. It can be run efficiently and effectively without duping the taxpayer. But back to that dupe, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Reform administration on Worcestershire County Council came cap in hand to the government. The government has granted them emergency funding. They've agreed, in effect colluded with Reform. You've got two parties here that have agreed to put up council tax for residents who they both promised that they would not do that, and as a result, residents in Worcestershire are paying the price. So my message to the Minister is very clear. If we want to maintain trust and integrity in politics at all levels, it's very important that those promises are stuck to, that they're abided by. Otherwise, don't make them in the first place. But most importantly of all, as over 1,100 Worcestershire residents in the last 48 hours have signed a petition opposing this increase, it's crucial that this goes to a referendum and the people of Worcestershire have their say.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start with the Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, who didn't give way when I asked? I think it's really important. I will happily give way in a moment should he wish to correct the record. But he said that the 2024 Labour manifesto that we stood on promised to freeze council tax. No such promise exists in that manifesto, and I'd invite him now to correct the record.
I thank him for giving way. Madam Deputy Speaker, residents across the country knew ahead of the general election that the Prime Minister had made various very public pledges that the Labour Party would freeze council tax should they come into office. Now, if there's an omission on my part that it was not worded in their manifesto, then I apologise for that. But the reality is, coming back to that point about trust in politics, if we want residents across the country to have faith in the political system, it's important that politicians stand by their promises, whether they're written in a manifesto or said on television.
Jonathan.
I thank him for that. I would say if we want trust in politics, we need to be accurate in what we say in this place. And I appreciate you correcting the record. Sorry, him correcting the record, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I start my substantive remarks, I do want to say that the Minister who is in her place now understands exactly what I'm going to say, and I know how sympathetic and supportive she is to this, and I'm hoping in the coming days that we will be able to deal with the issue that I'm going to raise, and I thank her for her support in recent weeks. I want to be clear about what Hartlepool is facing and why the current settlement I cannot regard as fair, but also believe to be self-defeating. Hartlepool now has the third highest number of children in care in England. That pressure has been made worse by other local authorities placing families in my town, leaving us with a £6 million overspend in children's social care alone. Now, my brilliant Labour Council has already taken decisive action, halving that projected deficit in year and putting in place robust, credible plans to eliminate it entirely. That plan is exactly what the government says it wants to see. Fewer children coming into care, more early intervention, stronger families and better outcomes. It includes strengthened early help and family support, a dedicated edge of care team, a refreshed in-house foster care model, safe reunification pathways, wholesale send reform, enhanced support for care leavers and better workforce planning. This is a serious preventative change, not sticking plaster solutions. But here is the problem. These reforms require short-term stability to succeed. This settlement does not recognise the sheer number of children in care in my constituency. In fact, it undermines the prevention, meaning we likely see more children in care, more long-term costs and worse outcomes. That's why I see this settlement as self-defeating. Ministers will rightly point to percentage increases in funding, but those percentages mean far less in Hartlepool than almost anywhere else because our baseline starts already so low. Yet the cost of a child in care is exactly the same in Hartlepool as anywhere else. And when you look at it in cash terms, the reality is stark. The increase in government grant for Hartlepool this year is just £3 million. That is the equivalent to around 6 children in care. And after weeks of discussions and representations, the final settlement for Hartlepool has remained unchanged. Yet down the road, and this does stick in the craw for me, I must say, reform-led Durham Council has received an additional £3.7 million this year, which means they are reducing how much they are increasing their council tax. That increase on the final settlement, from the provisional settlement, is more than our entire increase this year. I cannot describe that as fair funding. This unfairness, as we've heard from many members across the House, is compounded by a broken council tax system. Hartlepool has one of the weakest tax bases in the country, with a high proportion of homes in Band A. A 1% increase in council tax in Hartlepool raises a fraction of what it raises in wealthier areas. Yet our residents already pay far, far more, both in real terms and as a share of their income, than almost anywhere else in the country. This settlement simply does not change that reality. So when governments of all stripes talk about core spending power, and half of that core spending power is achieved by raising council tax, this calculation hammers the poorest communities most. It is a regressive tax. That's not fairness, it's entrenched inequality. To make matters worse, changes to deprivation measures and population assumptions mean Hartlepool's needs are being systematically underestimated. Official forecasts put our population at under 94,000, yet the ONS data already forecasts it closer to 100,000, growth driven in large part by other councils discharging their homelessness duties into my constituency. Hartlepool's not asking for special treatment. We are asking for support to deal with a problem not of our making, so we can deliver. I'll happily give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the honourable member is actually touching on an important point that in particular affects a lot of councils across the north of England, including Blackpool, neighbouring to myself, where larger metropolitan areas are effectively exporting their children in care problems to much cheaper areas such as Blackpool and Hartlepool, as the member represents, and maybe some kind of restriction on how far councils can move children who are being put into care might stop this basically dumping children in care in areas just because the housing is cheaper.
Jonathan Brash.
I would thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his comments, and I would endorse them wholeheartedly. I have heard stories of London boroughs, of Birmingham Council, putting families in taxis under the threat of get in the taxi or you're homeless, not knowing where they're getting out at the other end and discovering that they are in Hartlepool only when they arrive. Left for our council to deal with the pressure, left with our council to deal with the additional SEND needs, and left for our council to deal with the children who ultimately sometimes end up in care. It is a disgraceful practice and one that should rightly be cracked down on. And I know, again, the Minister is very, very alive to this problem and it needs to be dealt with. I will give way.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I just want to thank both honourable members in that interaction. Of course, the honourable member for Hartlepool is rightly talking about the financial consequences, but I just want to check and confirm with him that he thinks, as I do, as I'm sure the member opposite does, that it's the outcomes for those children that also must be abysmal, that we should also care about, and that's why he would agree with me, I'm sure, that this ought to be a priority.
Jonathan Brash.
I absolutely agree, and just this week there are stories in my local press about a family with children who frankly have been moved to a place with no connections, no familial links, no understanding of the local community, and the Minister is absolutely right. Those children are suffering as a result of the behaviour. Of course I'll give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. I just wanted to add my voice to this point, because in Croydon we find ourselves in a very similar situation where inner London boroughs will put their children into our part of London because the housing is slightly cheaper. However, I've also had constituents who have been faced with the exact situation the honourable member outlines, where they are threatened with homelessness, with the council discharging their duty if they do not take a placement in Birmingham, losing their job in some cases, their children losing their places at school, losing all connections to their family. So there needs to be a holistic look at this, at how we support councils to keep families locally, but also how we prevent councils having to pick up the tab for these terrible situations.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. I would absolutely endorse everything there, and I think part of that work needs to take a very, very close look at this funding settlement and look at those councils who have perhaps done very well out of this settlement to see whether they are still doing these things and moving people out of their area when they've actually got extra finances from this government. Happily.
Thank you to the honourable member to give me a chance to respond to the Minister as well as to the member. And as the former Police Commissioner for Lancashire, I saw first-hand the impact on communities of effectively dumping children from cities from miles away into high crime, high deprivation areas simply because the housing is cheaper, and the damage that has on their life chances, let alone the impact on communities that are often struggling with regeneration themselves and adding to the problems, is paramount. And I would be more than happy to meet with the Minister and the honourable member from Hartlepool to discuss how on the Fylde coast this is an issue, but across the north, and to discuss how we take it forward.
I would absolutely take him up on that invitation, and you've already mentioned Blackpool. I know honourable members who represent Blackpool would be very interested in that, and Stoke as well, which I believe makes up the top three in terms of the number of children in care. So I'll close by saying that without support to deal with this gap in our in-year funding for children's social care, the risk is clear. Prevention will fail, costs will rise, and vital community services like youth provisions, libraries, community hubs are put under threat. I fully support my Labour Council colleagues locally who have been clear that they are not prepared to make those cuts, which be so self-defeating in the round. It's a moment of profound seriousness for my constituency. Hartlepool has a plan for children's social care. It is aligned with the government's agenda. What we need now is a settlement that gives us a fair chance to deliver it. And so I say again to the Minister in her place, I have spoken today with our council leader and colleagues in Hartlepool. They are distraught, they are despondent, and they are profoundly worried about what the future holds in just a matter of days when the budget is due to be set in Hartlepool. So I appeal to her for any piece of support that she can give me. Thank you very much.
Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The settlement is unfair and is a disaster for my constituents in Wokingham. Wokingham Borough Council is already the lowest funded unitary authority per capita in the country and was under the Conservative government for more than 10 years. And now, as a result of this so-called fair funding review, this Labour government is cutting £43 million, a further £43 million from Wokingham Borough Council's government budget. Wokingham is a Liberal Democrat-run council, and they have done their best over the last 4 years to balance the books whilst coping with massively growing adult social care costs. When I was leader of the council, I tried to improve the settlement. My successor has continued to do this. These cuts will drive councils who are already struggling with rising costs for social care and children's services to possible breaking points. For 25-26, Wokingham Borough Council allocated 39% of its budget to adult social care and allocated 25% on children's services. So much of the council's budget is allocated to vital statutory services provided to residents, whether that's supporting SEND education, home-to-school transport, or social care for vulnerable adults. The government's cuts to funding will have significant implications for these services, implications that need to be grappled with and planned for by councils. But the settlement provides little information for local authorities like Wokingham on how to manage SEND costs until 2028, or how existing deficits, which increase every day, will be resolved. So I would urge the government to provide a clear timeline as for when councils will receive certainty on the SEND deficit. Without a clear timetable, responsible financial planning is not possible. But we cannot just consider short and medium-term solutions. I have spoken to many local care providers and have seen through casework that there is a real problem with spiralling provision costs and availability. The government must bring forward a fully funded long-term plan for adult social care reform, ensuring local authority funding settlements are not determined by the escalating costs of a social care system that is bankrupting councils and placing unsustainable pressure on the NHS. Action needs to be taken now, after years of Conservative neglect. From 2016, David Cameron and the 5 subsequent Prime Ministers promised reform to adult social care, and yet they have achieved nothing. Ultimately, the government needs to rethink its spare funding review 2.0 if it wants to avoid starving councils like Wokingham of much-needed cash to run their vital services.
Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. After 14 years of the Tories and coalition government, councils like mine in Knowsley were cut to the bone, and I represent what was the 3rd most deprived constituency in the country when I was elected. We didn't just experience pressure, we were absolutely stretched to breaking point, and deep sustained cuts went hand in hand with a huge and rising demand for services, and that is the legacy the last government left behind: unfair, fragmented and underfunded, stacked against places like mine. So I welcome this Labour government is taking a fundamentally different approach, and one that sees local councils as part of the solution to rebuilding Britain, not part of the problem. It marks an important change, and far from the days of the former Prime Minister boasting at a summer garden party in Tunbridge Wells about changing funding formulas to divert public money away from deprived urban areas like Knowsley are over. Instead, areas like mine, those hardest hit by historic funding cuts, will see greater investment based on need and deprivation. So I want to thank the Secretary of State and the Minister of State for Local Government for listening to me and my colleagues in this place. One of them from St Helens South and Whiston is by me right now, and from all across Liverpool City region, and my council's representations on the provisional settlement consultation, which would have not met the challenges that we face in Knowsley. It was absolutely right that they engaged with us constructively and worked to address the issues that we faced, which would have left Knowsley struggling. Madam Deputy Speaker, in Knowsley, the pressures that we face remain very real after being battered by the Tory and coalition government and austerity for so many years. But people really need to feel better off in their everyday lives, with improved public services and children's services and adult social care. They really need to feel the benefit of a Labour government to truly demonstrate that austerity is over. We need to do more, and I want to echo the words raised by so many colleagues around mine on these benches today about the regressive nature of council tax. Because Labour governments invest in lives and improves lives in communities like mine. Youth provision that gives young people safe places to go, positive role models and real opportunities, better support for the children who need it, and help for families who have too often been left fighting the system alone. Community spaces and parks that we can feel pride in placing where we live in high streets, libraries and leisure centres and more. I know that this government is committed to doing that for Knowsley, and I know that progress takes time. So today I celebrate, but tomorrow it will be no surprise for my honourable friend to hear that I will fight again for better still. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to pay a heartfelt tribute to Knowsley's council leader, Councillor Graham Morgan. He was out of the traps first on what we needed. He has been relentless through the consultation in making the case not just for my borough, but indeed for the whole of Liverpool City region, standing firm to ensure that this settlement is fairer. His persistence and counsel gave me the arguments and evidence I needed with colleagues from across Knowsley to stand up for our community in this place. It was true teamwork in action, the benefits of Labour MPs and a Labour Council working together. And I also want to put on record the work of our Metro Mayor, Steve Rotherham. He too fought for a fairer settlement for our city region with passion, clarity and determination. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the start of the road to a brighter future for Knowsley. Today marks a clear turning point from austerity, instability, cuts and neglect under the Conservatives to investment, fairness, partnership and certainty under Labour. I welcome the change of direction, but I will continue to fight for more and for better every single day for my constituents.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to take part in this debate, which has had a number of distinguished contributions, not least that of the Honourable Lady just now speaking on behalf of Knowsley. And as she rightly said, at this time when cost of living is biting so much on so many people, people really need to feel better off. And she also highlighted the regressive nature of council tax, which is why it's so regrettable that this settlement is built on the basis of putting up council tax on everyone. And it's exactly what the last Labour government did. In its 13 years, it doubled. It doubled the level of council tax, whereas over the 14 years of the Conservatives, it only grew little more than inflation, as it was held down for many years, though it went up and down over time. That is the history. The party opposite puts up council tax, even though its spokespeople speak about how terrible and regressive it is, and then they visit that on people in constituencies across the country. In my own constituency, the impact of the 4.99% annual expected rise in council tax, which they've put into all their figures about claiming there'll be increased spending power, it's based on sticking up tax by 5% and then another 5% and then another 5%. It's compounding. I'll come to the Honourable Gentleman in a while. That, for the cheapest home, the lowest value home in the East Riding, people very often in rural areas with very poorly insulated homes, with costly transport and low income, is going to be, by year 3, £200 a year out of already taxed income. That's the reality of what this Labour government is visiting on poor people in my constituency and other constituencies around the country, while they crow about it being fair. There's nothing fair about it. The local government finance settlement will mean one thing only for families in Beverley and Holderness: higher council tax bills when every other bill is soaring, again, thanks to this government. As the Secretary of State for Energy signs up the most expensive deals imaginable and puts up the price of energy, while we see the jobs tax, one of the most economically irrational taxes you could imagine, because it taxes jobs and it doesn't bring in any money because simply people employ fewer people, which is why that 26 billion hit on the economy comes down to single sectors. It's having, I will come to the Honourable Gentleman, but I'll make a little more progress first. And the reality, in talking to my constituents, Jenny in Cherry Burton said that she can't really afford to shop for healthy food because half her money is gone before she even gets home, forcing her to make choices that no family should have to make, simply to get through the week. Andrew in Beverley faces rising energy bills, as I've touched on, and rising food prices, he highlights, all the while supporting his 2 children at university, who can't find part-time work, Madam Deputy Speaker. Previously they would have done. They can't find part-time work because those jobs have tended to disappear. So there's fewer and fewer opportunities for young people to get on that jobs ladder and supplement the income while these students pile up student debt, which is only going to go up even more as time goes on. So these aren't abstract pressures, they're lived realities, and this settlement will pour on yet more misery. The Prime Minister says every minute not spent talking about the cost of living is a minute wasted, but warm words do not warm homes, and I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I appreciate the Honourable Member giving way. He made this point about core spending power, and by the way, I share his irritation at the use of core spending power because such a large percentage of it is in council tax. But it was introduced in 2016 by the last Conservative administration. The concept of core spending power, and including council tax, was introduced by the Conservatives. Can I ask him what he said at the time?
The Honourable Gentleman, I don't remember the specifics of that. What I can say is that whereas the last Labour government doubled council tax, despite it being regressive, that didn't happen under the Conservatives, whatever introductions there were. Those taxes were held down because that's what Conservatives do. They recognise that it's better to leave money in the pockets of people to make their own decisions, not take it away from them. And families across the East Riding are now asking a very simple question, because they know that promises don't pay bills. How does this local government finance settlement and the £200 council tax bombshell that follows it help them cope? Because let us be clear about what's happening, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor underfunds. Councils are squeezed, council tax rises, and families pay. And council tax is, of course, as so many members opposite have said, regressive. The lower the income, the heavier the burden. The smaller the home, the sharper the hit. At the very moment the household budgets are tightest, this government tightens them further. And nowhere is this clearer than in social care. Because in the first budget, the Chancellor allocated over $20 billion to health. And why? Didn't recognise that a lot of the problems in the NHS actually come from the failure of funding in social care. And could so easily, within the same spending envelope, have eased the pressure on the NHS by allowing social care to be better funded so it could draw out those who are ready to leave hospital from occupying the beds, which they have for the past years and they do today. So they didn't put sufficient money, additional money into social care. And in Beverley and Holderness, with ageing populations and rising adult care needs, that imbalance matters. Instead of funding care properly at source, ministers shift the cost onto council taxpayers. And then they claim that they fixed it. I saw the real-world cost of squeezed council budgets when I visited Sunk Island last month. I will give it way to the Honourable Lady in a moment. On Sunk Island Road and Brick Road, residents endure patch upon patch upon patch, repairs that never truly repair. They're paying more, yet still waiting for lasting fixes. This is the pattern. More tax, less certainty, higher bills, patchwork results. Government should strengthen communities, not squeeze them. So I ask the Minister, when families are stretched to breaking point, why is this government's answer yet another hiked bill? In Beverley and Holderness, the only change this government appears to deliver is the small change left in people's pockets after the Chancellor has emptied them. And I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Mary Rimmer. What can councillors do to fund the statutory duties? The people that we've given much better in the past, we have to ration the services, but the quality services and the integrated health has helped us with our social care. But under the Conservative, I don't want to go into party things, but it's a fact. St Helens were taking £127 million a year from the support grant. We left with something like 11 million coming from the government. That's what it was. That's why they need it, and that's why we would have been there. The only way you can get it is from Bunnings to provide the services. It's from the government and from the income to the councils. Where did they get it from? We've no assets to sell. We've very little. Yes, we've got low-paid jobs. So it is a high. But what we should be doing is taking it from the broader shoulders. We should be taking the burden. It's inappropriate. It's not compatible that the people on the lowest pay the biggest proportion of their incomes on the necessities of life, whilst those in millions, they've got the mansions and they've got a cottage. And I do please for the people that have the cottage and nothing else. They don't have the mansion in London. So we need to look at wealth.
Excellent. Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, who always speaks passionately and with deep knowledge of a community, and doesn't, as she alludes to, she doesn't make unnecessary party political points. I think the one thing which does unite the House, including the government front bench, is a recognition that the funding system's broken. But I spent many years campaigning across different funding pots on the distribution, because everyone looks at the quantum, they don't look at the distribution. You start to get into a world of complexity, and the number of people who turn up for your meetings on distribution gets very small. But it's actually critical. But what we do need is a new funding settlement. How you deliver that in the political realities And you've got to go in early and hard, and unfortunately this government hasn't. They're delaying and delaying. Their political power and potency weakens, and it becomes harder and harder to deliver. It's a bit like, I think, the police reorganisation we touched on earlier today is unlikely to happen in the dribs and drabs of a government which is struggling. But we do need a long-term settlement that based on need. Now, there's no perfect assessment of that, but what we have is complexity as a brilliant speech from the member for North Norfolk on the Lib Dem benches earlier, has elements about how many pubs you've got and what some level of cost was in 1991 and all sorts of other things. So the truth is, it's this most fundamental of services to her constituents in deprived areas and mine, this most fundamental set of services, 800 services, I think my colleague rightly identified, all of these things are actually, nobody can see the transparency. And what we're actually getting, and I'm going to bring myself to a close because I've already gone over the time I said I would do, so I won't give way to the honourable gentleman, it is just to say we do need, and perhaps we should look on the backbenches initially for cross-event views to build a fairer funding system. And just to take one thing, I don't know why no one's talked about it very much in my 21 years in this place, the fact that a £200,000 house in Beverley pays a lot more tax than a £2 million flat in central London is absurd. And very rarely does anybody mention it. And we need to fix things. If we can't fix something as absolutely inexcusable as that, and we haven't collectively, then we all need, and no wonder the public are looking at us so askance. So let's come out of here and be very happy to talk to the Honourable Lady and the member for Hartlepool and others and see where we can make some common ground to have a more rational system, because at the end of all this complexity and lack of transparency ends up in social failure, where, as the Honourable Lady rightly and passionately says, it's those who have the most vulnerable, are the least able, who pay the highest price. And whether that's in her part of the world or mine, that's not acceptable. And if we've come in here, all of us came here to make it a better place. And one of the things we need to fix is this.
Terry Jeremy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was first elected back in 2008, and I stood for a by-election for my local town council, and I was 22. It was by chance, really, and the opportunity came up to put myself forward to stand to represent my local community. And as it happened, I beat the head teacher of the local high school in that by-election. Up until recently, it was my favourite election win. But I then went on to stand for the district council a few years later, and a few years after that, I stood for Norfolk County Council. And I ended up spending more than 12 years on all three tiers of local government in Norfolk. And what I found was a world of local government officers, local councillors, working incredibly hard to serve their local communities, trying to save money, to almost work the impossible by constantly striving for efficiencies, by doing whatever they possibly could. Good councils, good councillors are a real force for good. They can achieve so many wonderful things and are really overshadowed in many ways by national government. And I really wanted to put on record my thanks for local government. And I think we saw that during COVID, because it was local government particularly that really rose to that challenge to serve. What we saw during my time, I was elected, as I say, in 2008, and for the vast majority of my time as a local councillor, we saw cuts after cuts after cuts. Every single February budget-setting council meeting was just this constant battle to try and save money, and both councils, Brecon District Council, Norfolk County Council, were Conservative-led, Conservative government, and we were cutting services constantly. What we ended up with was massively weakened resilience and, frankly, services that bound our communities together were eroded. These were not just numbers on a balance sheet. In Norfolk, it meant that we were closing children's centres. We were removing support for disabled people. We were closing entirely the youth service in Norfolk and selling off assets. And it was just this constant battle. So I do understand the predicament the government is in, and I do have a significant amount of sympathy, because it will take years to undo the constant cuts and eroding of that resilience, and it's not going to be easy to turn that around. I wanted to make 3 particular points to the Minister, if I may. The first is about rural services specific. I'm very proud to represent South West Norfolk. It's a very rural constituency, and I cover half of 2 district, Brecon District and Kings Lynn and West Norfolk Borough Council areas, very rural councils, and it is expensive to provide services to a rural community. And I am pleased that social care in particular is being acknowledged as being expensive. Across the whole of the county of Norfolk, social care is particularly expensive. But other district council services in rural areas are expensive too. And I think specifically planning. We are a government that wants growth. We want growth all across the country, including in rural areas. We massively need to support planning services in rural areas to achieve growth potential and not have planning applications sat lingering for determination. It is very difficult to recruit planning officers for rural district councils, and that is a barrier to growth in rural areas. The other is housing. I've been constantly shocked and concerned about the state of housing in my constituency in South West Norfolk. Huge issues with rural housing, with damp and mould, draft, all sorts of challenges that we're dealing with in my office. The housing challenges in rural areas are expensive, and very often we are having, as a council, to transport people from one end of the county to the other or out of the county because there is a lack of suitable temporary and emergency accommodation available. The second point I wanted to make was around hidden deprivation. The council ward that I represented, despite being in a rural area, was within the top 10% most deprived in the country. We had very low wages, poor health, and skills and educational attainment was low. And I'm very concerned that in so many government metrics, intense deprivation in rural areas is masked by more affluent surroundings. And I hope the government comes up with a system where we can properly account for and recognise intense deprivation in a rural area and not just look at the overall council boundary. The last point I wanted to make, and it was touched upon by the Honourable Member for North West Norfolk, which is internal drainage boards. And I appreciate that it is slightly niche because there are only a certain number of constituencies in the country where this is relevant, but certainly in Norfolk, in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. These are critical pieces of infrastructure which frankly remove water from significant amounts of land, both residential and agricultural. If we did not have IDBs operating, there would be so much of our land, particularly agricultural land, that just would not be usable and really weaken our food security in this country. I have dozens of IDBs in South West Norfolk, and I've spent a lot of time visiting them. They do incredible work, but it should be noted that those councils that have internal drainage boards in their area are impacted and their finances are impacted to a great extent. In Kings Lynn and West Norfolk Borough Council, for every £1 of council tax you pay, 43p goes on IDB levies. In the 25-26 financial year, that council is spending £3.7 million just on IDB levies, which many councils obviously don't have that expense, but are unique pressures for those areas. IDBs, the costs have gone up a lot because of electricity costs, frankly, going up manning the pumps. I have the largest pumping station in Europe in my constituency, in Wigan Hall, St Germans, and this network across the area, and it just gives me an opportunity, if I may, to mention one in particular which I visited, which was in Wellington a couple of weeks ago, and I met Ken Goodger, Patrick Claiborne and Carl Nunn. My real concern with IDBs is that this is infrastructure which is 50, 60 years old, costing a fortune to maintain, and at some point it will fail, and we need to have investment in IDBs, one on the capital costs, but also on the revenue costs. And I would urge the government to continue the support for IDBs, councils affected by IDBs, as we move forward, because they are absolutely crucial pieces of infrastructure. Thank you.
John Milne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We've heard a lot about the coalition years and austerity today, to the extent that I began to wonder if I'd misread the title of the debate. Whatever the rights and wrongs of austerity, it was the conventional wisdom of the time. Had we been in coalition with Labour, I think the same thing would have happened, perhaps under another brand. For the time, me personally, I was living in Ireland, working in Ireland the whole time, Republic of Ireland. They actually carried out a much more severe austerity, and the economy bounced back very well. We can argue about whether it was because of austerity or in spite of austerity. That's an argument for the economists. I'd like to also thank the honourable lady who's just leaving, member for St Helens South and Whiston, for her comments on not wanting this to be a zero-sum game between taking away from some and at the expense of another. So I very much agree with her and many other members that particularly the deprived areas, particularly inner urban areas, who have been very unfairly treated over a very long time. Something needed to happen. I wholly agree with that. However, it should not be at the expense of other rural areas, which I represent. Where are we now? And again, I'd like to applaud the government for actually taking some action on this whole issue. It's been kicked down the road for many years. I also applaud the writing off of 90% of SEND deficits. It must have been a difficult decision. It had to be done. It was never going to be paid for by local authorities. Also in that area, the government is committed to centralising SEND spending from 28-29, but what we're not sure of is how far that commitment will truly go. Will it only cover the high needs block deficits, or will it reflect all the other costs around SEND provision, such as home to school transport and other aspects? Because in counties like West Sussex, where I represent, SEND transport costs have risen dramatically over recent years. These pressures, they don't sit neatly in one budget line, they ripple across children's services and transport budgets. We're also still awaiting clarity on what's going to happen with the EHCPs. Adjacent to my constituency, Michelle Catterton, who is the head of Moon Hall School, has spoken clearly about how vital EHCPs are to families. Sustainability cannot be achieved by weakening the legal right to in HCP or by diluting councils' duties to fund them, and I'm very concerned that that is what is about to happen. When ministers are asked directly about this, what will happen to HCP protections, the answers have been far from clear. Parents must have certainty. EHCPs must not become a backdoor route to cost cutting. I also have serious concerns about the evidential basis of elements of this settlement. My local council, Horsham District Council, was initially projected to be operating with a healthy surplus. However, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has now flagged up miscalculations in the business rate valuations, and unfortunately that position has now inverted into a deficit. Many councils operating within business rate pools, as Horsham District Council does, have found that funding formulas did not properly account for those arrangements until very late in the process. As the District Council's network has warned, changing allocations between the provisional and the final settlement due to revised policy assumptions is deeply destabilising. Councils are entitled to ask on what evidential basis are these formulas being constructed. 2018 departmental research suggested that population is actually often a more accurate predictor of need than deprivation alone. Yet, this settlement has put all the weighting onto deprivation. Why can we see the justifications and rationales? Deprivation, of course, exists across the country, and that includes in rural communities such as my own. It may be in pockets, but it's still there, and it's still felt just as deeply. We know that geography is a major cost driver for councils. Rural councils face longer travel times for care workers, higher transport costs for schools, dispersed populations, thinner provider markets, and recruitment challenges. Yet, metropolitan councils are projected to receive significantly higher per-head funding increases. In some comparisons, government funding spending power rises by around 20% in metropolitan areas, but just 2% in rural areas. In county areas like West Sussex, when it comes to the funding increases, approximately 98p in every pound will have to be raised locally, as opposed to just 58p for metropolitan areas. That's a terrific difference. That imbalance raises legitimate questions about fairness between places. And that brings me to what I would say is the most fundamental inconsistency. The government recognises remoteness as a cost factor in adult social care. So why is remoteness not consistently recognised in children's services and in school transport and in wider service delivery? How can distance and sparsity increase cost for adults, but apparently not for children? If geography does drive cost, and in rural counties it definitely does, then it must be reflected consistently across all funding formulas. Finally, the reintroduction of the recovery grant is welcome in principle. But why is its allocation still based on deprivation indicators from 2019 when more recent data exists and has been elsewhere across government? When millions of pounds are being distributed, councils deserve clarity that allocations reflect current realities, particularly given the economic shifts of recent years. Without that transparency, we have mistrust. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, councils stand ready to work with government, but they must have in return fairness, clarity, and clear evidence. Thank you.
Richard Bard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This final settlement for local government finance does not bring good news for Devon. Research by the Rural Services Network has shown that urban councils will have significantly more government-funded spending power per head than rural councils. By 2028-29, urban councils will have seen a 20% increase in government-funded spending power compared to an increase of just 2% for rural councils. And yet, on average, in rural economies, the wages are lower than the national average wage. This settlement will place a significantly greater expectation on council taxpayers in rural areas to cough up. Let's consider what effects this might have on residents of Mid and East Devon by noting what things are already like for people living in one village of East Devon. Dalwood is a village with a population of about 460. The village is half a mile from the main road, an A road, and one of the two access routes to the village has been underwater since November. I heard from one resident that the state of the road is so poor that she was charged £1,000 for car repairs as a result of negotiating the pitted, crumbling access road. She makes the point that East Devon and its residents pay some of the highest rates of council tax in the country. In a league of the highest rates in the country for a Band D property, East Devon is rated 305 out of 350, where the 350th local authority is paying the most. The government announced last month that it will be making available £7.3 billion for road maintenance over the next 4 years. When people in Devon hear about numbers like that, they wonder whether officials and contractors are going out to the cash machine, drawing out the money as cash, mixing it with paste, using it to make papier-mâché and filling the potholes that way. Because the reality is that the money is not finding its way to Devon. Devon has the largest road network in the country at 13,000 kilometres. Last March, the repair backlog for the roads in Devon alone would have required an extra £384 million to make good. The reality is that Devon was able to spend little more than £60 million on road maintenance last year. Take another example. One resident of Sidmouth wrote to me recently, "I, for one, have paid out damages to my vehicle in 5.5 years, the sum of £5,100. They continue, "Here we are, living in the UK, an advanced country with the lanes, A roads and B roads in an appalling state of repair." That is the context of the local government settlement as it relates to Devon. This local government settlement has removed the remoteness uplift from the area cost adjustment. The settlement does this in all of the relative needs formulas, with the one exception of adult social care. And I'm glad that the government has acknowledged that adult social care costs more when it's done and delivered in a rural area. But the government has been blind to the needs of rural communities by removing the remoteness uplift from other areas of local government, including road maintenance. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, councils in rural areas don't have the same economies of scale that urban areas enjoy. The countryside requires more bases from which services can be delivered. The countryside has fewer contractors with less competition. The countryside cannot have the same economies of scale as cities and big towns. I urge the government to think again about the remoteness uplift. Thank you.
Shadow Minister.
With the leave of the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, when the Prime Minister said there would be no tax rises on working people, I imagine that the working people who are about, in some cases, to receive a £500 a year increase in their council tax, the working people in Westminster who expect an 82% rise in their council tax, those in Wandsworth who expect an 87% rise in their council tax as a result of this settlement, will wonder if working people was a phrase that applied to them. And those in our business community who heard the Prime Minister say to them that a Labour government would introduce, to quote, permanently lower business rates, will wonder where the massive rise in their business rates bill has come from. There are things, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this statement that give the opportunity to make tweaks, make changes and make progress. I know I'm grateful to the Minister for the interest that she's shown, for example, in the way that the Local Growth Fund, whose method of distribution is having a huge impact, particularly on colleagues in Northern Ireland, offers some scope for some adjustment. But it is very clear that the recovery grant, which the Secretary of State has spoken of, still bears little or no relation to the pressures arising from the statutory duties of local authorities. And it leaves, as we've heard from across the House, councils tens of millions of pounds short of the money they need to do the minimum that is required of them by this government before addressing some of those broader, more general issues. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have two motions before us this evening. One of those is on the statement itself, the other is on the referendum limit. And I'm sure we've all noted the complete absence of any reform members from the Chamber during this debate tonight. And I'd like to pay tribute to the champions of Worcestershire, the members for Bromsgrove and for Wyre Forest, who spoke up for the residents against an authority that, having been part of a party that promised no rises in council tax and cuts in office, is now looking to top the league table with the largest council tax rises this year in the country. They should be ashamed of the messages and the misinformation that those election campaigns gave to residents. So let me finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, with some things which I hope the Minister might address in her summing up. The first is what this statement does to support housing delivery. Now, we know from the recent report from Savills that 23 of London's 33 boroughs report net zero new homes being commenced this quarter. Lambeth has been very public, and I know the Secretary of State is particularly familiar with that, as is the Chair of the Select Committee, has reported net zero new social homes in their housing delivery. So it's clear that housing delivery is collapsing at a time when lofty ambitions are being set. At the same time, the grants in the statement for homelessness are cash flat, for care costs are cash flat, for vulnerable children are cash flat, for care leavers are cash flat. So it's clear for all of the bluster, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the smoke is clearing, the mirror is not particularly shiny. The impact that the relentless rises on national insurance contributions, business rates, even the addition of an additional £750 million of costs to local authorities from changes to the emissions trading scheme will put huge pressure on the ability of local authorities to deliver. And having said that the Secretary of State wanted to move away from a bidding process, we now hear that the funding that's been announced without any detail for special educational needs deficits is going to be the subject of a bidding process to the Department for Education, in which there will be a requirement for a reform plan. And it will be interesting to hear set out how that reform plan differs from the safety valve agreements which many of those authorities already have in place, which are reducing those SEND deficits year on year. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, what is clear in this settlement is that the government is not meeting even its own standards on local government. Local democracy is paying the price, with elections cancelled and taxes relentlessly rising. This statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, must be seen for what it is. It's a council tax bombshell. It's a business rates bombshell. It's part of a picture of a Labour government that simply cannot manage the money.
Minister. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, it's my pleasure to close this debate, despite the fact that I must apologise to the House. Many members in this House will know that I suffer from chronic migraine, and I've been having an attack over the past couple of days. So I might not be as long in my contribution as I might otherwise have been. But in show business and in politics, the show must go on, albeit my speech might be slightly shorter than it would have otherwise been. But I think that will be of joy to many members in the House. Calm down. The Secretary of State and I know what a difference the hard work of councillors, frontline staff and all our mayors makes. And we would like to pay tribute to them for everything they do for their communities, as many members across the House have. But we also know the consequences of the unfairness of the funding system. The last decade and a half of austerity was felt by the most deprived local authorities because the link between funding and deprivation was broken. Now, I would just say that the Shadow Minister seemed to imply in his remarks that he thought that the link ought to simply be with statutory duties rather than any consideration at all of the impact that deprivation makes. And I would just say to him, to those communities that suffered most, were left out for far too long, and who struggled with the consequences of deprivation, they will wholeheartedly disagree with him. Today, that's why we are restoring the link with deprivation and ending the irrational inequality of the previous funding system. We are, as many have said, providing the first multi-year settlement in a decade. We're investing in changing our public services, and we're simplifying funding for local government. And I want to thank honourable members on all sides of the House for their contributions today. I think that the honourable gentleman has had ample time to contribute. And whilst I would normally give way with gusto and have a bit of political knockabout with him, today is not the day for that. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank him and everybody else who's contributed to the consultation on the provisional settlement and to the members who made representations to me directly. Madam Deputy Speaker, there could be no quick fixes. We cannot undo over a decade of damage overnight. But the settlement we are discussing today is our most significant move yet to make English local government more sustainable. And I am committed to going further in coming years to fix the pressures our councils are facing. And the Secretary of State set out the various mechanisms that we are employing to do that in his opening speech. This Labour government has backed local government through action, and since coming to power, we have made available a nearly 25% increase in core spending power in 28-29, worth £16.6 billion. Now, just to turn very briefly to points that members made, the member for Taunton and Wellington relayed the situation with flooding in the Somerset levels, and I would like to send my support to his constituents, and I will work with the flooding minister as required. The chair of the Select Committee and the former chair of the Select Committee told me to be bold, and I would say to them, I will try, but I look forward to their support in persuading all of our colleagues in this place to vote for whatever bold solutions we come up with. Members, including the member for Hartlepool and the member for Fylde as well, and other members, the member for Croydon, talked about failures in children's care, and I feel sure that we'll be working together on that. Many members talked about their experiences of councils struggling, but often achieving, despite that struggle, to provide great innovative services on lean budgets, and we applaud them all for it. Madam Deputy Speaker, as part of this, I'm determined not to give way, if that's okay, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we need to bring this debate to a close. But just before just before I do, the Honourable Member for Sedentary Position asked me about remoteness. I have discussed this with many members in detail, one-to-one, and I would repeat again, there are other ways in which the actual costs of providing services in each place are taken account of in this settlement, and through the area cost adjustment and other means. So I don't agree with what's been said, but I don't want to detain the House any longer. But just before I do finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, I had a wonderful January engaging with many members across this House on the settlement. It was a fascinating opportunity to hear about the uniqueness of every area. But I particularly want to thank my colleagues from Knowsley, from St Helens, from Gateshead and from Banbury for their way in which they engaged on this settlement and the contribution they made to the settlement as it is today. I'm grateful for it, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank all honourable members once again for their valuable contributions today. The Government is under no illusion about the scale of the challenge that local authorities are facing as they continue to deal with the legacy of the previous system. But our changes will make a big difference, and they will get money to where it is needed most, creating a fairer and evidence-based funding system, and most importantly, to me and many others, restoring the link between funding and poverty. And I commend this statement to the House.
The question is the motion on local government finance report as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Aye. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Jade Bottrell, Gregor Poynton. Tellers for the noes, Andrew Snowden, Katie Lamb. Order.
The ayes to the right, 277. The noes to the left, 143.
The ayes to the right were 277. The noes to the left were 143. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. I call the Minister to move the motion on referendums relating to council tax increases formally.
Formally.
Order. The question is the motion on referendums relating to council tax increases as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no.
No.
Division. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.
No.
Tellers for the ayes, Jade Botterill, Gregor Poynton. Tellers for the noes, Andrew Snowden, Katie Lamb.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 279. The noes to the left, 90.
The ayes to the right were 279, the noes to the left were 90. So the ayes have it, Unlock.